The sky beyond the Erie's carved moon crescent was so black, it seemed to drink the torchlight that touched it. Wind moved like a living thing along the high galleries, slipping through the seams in the pale stone, and lifting the sleeping curtains in Lysa's chamber, with the gentleness of a nursemaid's hand. The mountain made its own night, even when the moon was full, hushing the world to a thin whisper that could be mistaken for memory. Below, far below, the world ended in a plummet of air and starlight. Above, the jagged teeth of the mountains of the moon gnawed on the firmament as they had gnawed on every age of man. She sat in her night robe with her feet drawn up beneath her like a girl's, hair unbound, a single lamp fighting the dark. The chamber had been Joan's, and then theirs, and now it was stone and cold, and an altar to absence. Ravens muttered in the rookery 2 towers over. From the nursery came the faintest wheeze, her boy sleeping, her little falcon breathing in those fragile, frightened rills, and each time Lysa's head turned toward that sound, as if she could will the air to cradle him more softly. She had dismissed the maid, dismissed the dainty supper, dismissed Maester Coleman with a smile that masked a pinch of irritation when he fussed over the boy's night draught. The table before her was a scatter of wax and seal, parchment and string. The Arryn falcon stood crisp in blue wax on 3 letters already. Wings spread above a moon, beak sharp. The 4th lay blank save for the shape of words in her mind. There had been a time when she had been content to hide her fear inside her husband's good hands. Jon had held the veil like a father holds a sleeping child, all careful strength, all patience. He had been kind to her. He had been stern with the lords who bickered like children beneath the high white towers. He had been patient with the boy who would not thrive. He had been patient even with her, and that had made her feel small, and then ashamed for feeling small, and then angry because shame was a cold blanket that never warmed. He had eaten a pear that day, and smiled at its sweetness, and told her he would return before the candles guttered, and then he had not. The memory she liked to show the world was that the Lannisters had taken Jon's life as they took what pleased them. The most secret memory. Hers alone, hers and one other, was a little vial of tears, and a whisper in a voice she had loved, too long to name. Pedder's voice did not carry like wind. It came like the soft press of a hand to her cheek, warm and dry, smelling faintly of mint and ink. It had come in a letter 2 nights ago with words as precise as stitches. I have a plan that will keep our sons safe. I have a plan that will keep you safe. You must trust me as you did when we were young. You must let the falcons fly. She had read it 10 times with the hunger of a starving cat licking a fishbone. Each time the meaning seemed to grow more certain. The Lannisters were wolves in silk and gold. They would soon devour what they could reach. Her sister's husband, Eddard, who wore honor like an old cloak, was in the city of vipers, poking their nest with a righteous stick. The king's health wavered like a drunkard's vow. Pettier said the city would burn soon enough, whether with torches or with whispers, and all who were not already on a chosen side would be ash. The veil could not be ash. The veil was hers. The veil was Sweet Robin's. And if Pettier said there could be a king who would be gentle to the veil, who would make a shield from falcon wings and smile at her when she entered a hall, who would say her name as if it mattered, then why should she not let the falcons fly? She dipped her quill and began to write to Bronze Jan Royce in a hand that mimed calm certainty. You will rouse the banners of the East in the king's name for the protection of realm and right. Gulltown must ready its ships, Lord Grafton to take counsel from you, and from our steward, Sir Nestor, and from Sir Horton Redford. The host is to make sail for Storm's End with all haste. Lord Renly Baratheon is to be advised that the Vale comes as friend and ally, as befits old oaths and the needful order of the realm. Her quill paused a heartbeat on friend and ally. The words made her feel daring. She could see Renly in the mind's mirror, laughing in green velvet, bright as wine. He had complimented her once, laughed, really, and called her fair as the moon over a winter hill. And she had smiled all day at nothing anyone could see. She sealed that letter and reached for the next, addressed to Horton Redford, then to Michel Redford, then to Lord Belmore at Strongsong, Lord Hunter among his green forests, Lord Corbray with his pale sword and hungers. To Grafton at Gulltown she wrote a firmer hand. Ships, shifts of oarsmen, fresh water loaded, biscuit and salt beef in abundance. She surprised herself with practicalities, then felt pride like a hot stone. John would have written in such terms, careful and dry. She was not merely Petir's echo. She was a mother making a bed of spears around her child. Let the world call it ambition if it pleased them. She called it love. When she finished, the lamp had burned lower, and the mountains outside were deeper blackness within blackness. The wind had turned cold enough to make the candle's flame narrow. She stood, went to the nursery, and stood long at the foot of the little bed where her son slept with his mouth open, lashes damp on his cheeks, small hands splayed in helpless supplication. "All for you," she whispered to his skin. "All for you." He stirred and made a sound she could not name. By dawn, ravens darted from the Eyrie toward a handful of spired holds and cliff-built keeps scattered through the vale like bones of giants. The messages went with them, blue wax flashing, the Arryn seal pressed deep. At the gates of the moon, the snowmelt stream had shrunk to a clear ribbon, and men looked up from their morning fires to watch black wings cut the sky. Word ran faster than birds down the mountain road that wound like a pale belt from the high castle to the lower redoubt. Before the first hour had finished, the news had found the bloody gate, and Sir Nestor Royce had read Lysa's words, with his lips pressed thin and his brows making a roof for his eyes. Nestor's hair had gone to iron long ago. His voice still carried the weight of oaths in it. He did not love Lysa as his lord had, but the veil had been the breath he breathed since he had been a long-limbed squire riding behind his father's knee. He stood in the shadow of the gate, that ancient maw toothed with angled stone, and watched dust rise beyond from goatherds crossing the morning slope. "In the king's name," he said softly, and meant the name of a man who still lived but waned like a tide field through stone. Behind the words, he could hear the clamoring of the little birds in King's Landing who made King's name into a sharp tool. He called his captains. He sent riders up valley toward Ironoax, an old anchor with words for Sir Horton and House Linderley. He sent runners to Gulltown to bid Lord Grafton clear his harbor of fishing boats and make room for knights and their horses. He sent for wagons and biscuit and salt meat and new shoes for horses. He sent for the smiths to beat spearheads from pig iron a little harder and the Fletchers to pull goose feathers from great careful heaps. In the afternoon light, he stood beside the portcullis and watched Jan Royce's standard climb the road like a blunt-shouldered soldier. Bronze Jan came all in dull iron and old leather. He rode bareheaded, rune-etched gorget, dark against his throat, hair blown back from a face that had not tried to be young for 30 years. The Royce sigil, a bronze disc ringed with runes the old way, hung from a banner pole, borne by a boy whose cheeks were chapped raw. Jan filed under the stone arch, dismounted with a groan that he did not make a show of, and embraced Nestor as men who had bled for the same lord do. "Orders from the Eyrie," Nestor said without ceremony. He handed the letter over. Jan broke the blue wax and read without lowering his head. "Storm's End," he said when he had done. He looked past the gates to the west, where the world folded into ridges, and then south toward the far, invisible sea. She uses the words friend and ally like flint. "Sir Nestor." "That she does," Nestor said. King's Landing grows uneasy. The Northman plucks at a knot that was meant to strangle in secret. If lions make to leap, the falcons will not fly fast enough to escape a claw. Or so the lady says. "Namden. Ellie. Bell. And Littlefinger?" Jan said almost idly, as he turned the parchment over and held it to the light as if there might be words hidden in the fibers. "Do you see his print here, Sir Nestor?" Nestor's mouth tightened. "I see a mother's fear. I am not so clever as Lord Petyr, but fear is a spur sharp enough to make horses bleed." Jan grunted. "Fear does not make ships out of air. We'll need Grafton to empty his harbor. We'll need biscuit enough to feed a small city and oars to pull a floating one. And we'll need patience for the storm we'll sail into." "Ben she. We'll have what we can take," Nestor said. "We always have." Jan sent for his sons that afternoon. Robar came first, laughing, cheeks flushed from a training yard bout, hair damp beneath his helm. He had his father's bones and his mother's eyes, and a joy in battle that had not yet been soaked. There was Waymar too, grave as a book despite his years, though Waymar's path lay with the Night's Watch in another telling of the world. Jan took them aside beneath the shadow of an old stone tower with runes so worn they had become memory rather than mark. "The Vale marches," he said simply. "We march to the sea. From the sea we sail to Storm's End. We go not to sack an enemy, but to make a friend. If that enemy comes to us in the making, we will do what is left to men with steel." Robar's grin widened like dawn. "Renly Baratheon," he said, tasting the name. "His is a court of bright nights and soft words. They say he laughs when he fights and fights when he laughs. They say he—" "I have no interest in what they say," Jan cut in, stern but not unkind. "Men say all manner of things when the wind is fair. We will go. You will go. And you, Robar, keep your mirth for the feast and your eyes for the field. No man's laughter ever warded a spear." Robar bowed his head. The laughter did not wholly leave his face, but it learned quiet. Father. Ips. That word traveled like smoke over water. In Gulltown, Lord Grafton held court in a hall that smelled of tar and salt and wine. He was not a tall man, but he wore his velvet like men taller than him had worn steel. When the Raven came, he sat in his chair until the wax was set, then broke it with a quick, neat hand. He read and called for the harbor master, and for the captain of his own galleys, and for the head of the salt markets. The gulls outside the windows wheeled and screamed like 1,000 querulous maids. Clear the inner docks of every fisher's skiff, he ordered without preface. Drive them to the outer roads if you must. Pay them with coin and curses as you see fit. The Arryn host will be upon us in days. I will not have horses drowned because some salt wife claims the right to keep her boat where her father kept his. Then, he turned to a clerk. Salt beef, biscuit, fresh water, lemons and limes in such quantity as can be had without beggaring us. The knights will curse me if they shit blood halfway to Duskendale. I would rather they curse me for thin beer. The harbor master, a woman with lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting into sun and spray, scratched behind her ear with a tar-blackened nail. How many ships, my lord? As many as we can take without begging the sisters, Grafton said, then paused. Send word to the Sunderlands on the Three Sisters for ferries. They'll rob us with a smile, but they'll float our horses when our hulls are fat. A boy named Tom, with wrists the width of carrots and a mind like a good knife, ran down the quays that day with a slate and chalk, marking hulls for seizure and the names of captains who would fight and those who would pretend to, and those who would smile as they took coin and do as they liked regardless. He watched men pull tarps from oarbanks, watched women roll barrels with arms thick as rigging, watched a priest of the Seven toss a blessing onto a coil of rope, as if grace would keep it from fraying. He had never been to Storm's End, but old sailors spoke of its long stooped shoulders, and the way the sea threw itself against that stone as if it hated it. He wrote the number of a barge in a sharp hand, and imagined he was a small part of a thing too big for any hand to hold. That imagination made him straighten when wind shoved him, made him smile when gulls stole his chalk. In King's Landing, heat lay on the city like a hand. The Tourney fields were memory now, their trampled grasses beaten to brown. The river stank of fish and rot and gold. Renly Baratheon stood in the shade of a silk awning in his chambers and held a letter like a lover's arm. Friend and ally, he read aloud, grinning. And Sir Loras Tyrell smiled because he had taught himself to be happy when Renly was. The grin made his face younger than it had any right to be after all the cuts he had tasted to win his spurs. His hair shone as if the sun had been made to flatter him. He wore simple linen in green because today, for once, he did not need velvet to make bold men look small. Little birds fly, Loras murmured, touching the Arryn seal with a finger that was light and sure. This one crows like a falcon. Renly laughed and flung himself into the chair beneath the awning, long legs sprawled, the picture of a man for whom wait was a thing that happened only to others. He had never learned to sit like a king because he had never had to. He had learned to look like one without thinking. "So the Vale marches for Storm's End," he said, and the words made music to his ear. Bronze Yon will scowl even as he obeys. Nestor will count barrels and make fishermen cry. That woman in her mountain eyrie will tell herself that she has done this for her child. Pettier will smile at a mirror. "And you?" Loras asked softly. Renly looked past him to the window where the city stretched, red roofs and redder dust, towers pricking a sky that pretended to be blue. He thought of his brother Stannis, with his clenched jaw and counting fingers. He thought of his brother Robert, a giant whose thunder was now a cough. He thought of Cersei's eyes, green and flat as summer marshes where the frogs had died. He thought of Eddard Stark, with his honor like a shield that would never fit Renly's arm. He thought of Mace Tyrell, who could be steered with flattery the way a fat sloop could be steered by current, and of Marjorie, who could make a hall breathe differently by entering it. He thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he was made to be looked at and loved, and that this was not shameful but right. He stood. He put the letter down and smoothed it with his hand. "Now we write to Highgarden again," he said, cheerful and firm. "We speak of old oaths and new chances. We tell Lord Mace that the East flies to me. We hint at marriage with all the subtlety of a perfumed kiss. We tell him that if he moves first, he will be praised for boldness. If he moves last, he will be scolded for caution. He likes praise more than scolding." "He likes praise more than scolding?" Loras's smile thinned at the mention of marriage, then learned to be bright again with a practice that had long since ceased to hurt. "It would be a fine match," he said, and meant it in two ways. Renly took Loras' hand and looked at it as if it were a lit taper. "We will build a world," he said, as if the sentence were as easy as fastening a cloak brooch. "And not the kind that men make with pretense and parchment and hidden knives alone. A world with feasts and games and laughter, yes, but with order like a song that everyone knows. A world where a boy in the Vale can sleep without coughing blood from fear, where a fisher girl in black crown can keep her boat, where the hand that gathers taxes does not pinch so hard a man bleeds pride." "And now?" Loras's fingers closed around his. "You make pretty promises," he said. "I suppose we will need ships to carry them." "Gultown's ships," Renly said, and his teeth flashed. "Lord Grafton will fill his harbor with green cloaks if he thinks it will keep him in velvet. The Vale will slide down the coast like a great white knife. King's Landing will learn how to lower its gaze. And now, Eddard Stark will not like your knife at his throat," Loras said. "Eddard Stark," Renly said, with more fondness than he had willingly shown before to any man not named Robert. "I love him for a thing I could never be, and hate him for the same. He thinks the world can be made as it was when he was a boy, and his father held court with a word. I think the world can be made as I can think it. If we are both wrong, the world will laugh at us in different keys." "Damn." Loras lifted the Arryn letter again, and turned it so light shone through it, and made the words ghostly. "Tell me what you will do when the ships anchor beneath Storm's End," he said. Renly told him with a smile that had more steel in it than a summer face had any right to show. In the Tower of the Hand, Eddard Stark unrolled a different letter, and read Lysa's neat loops with a mouth that became a scar. The rush of traffic in the yard below drifted up through the open arch, with a smell of horse and tar and piss. The day was hot and clear. He felt cold and clouded. "She will send the Vale south," he said to no one in particular, then to himself more simply. Lysa. He had known her as a girl with laughter like an empty bell, all echo. He had known her as a woman with secrets in her wrists like veins. He had known Jon Arryn as a man who could soothe a storm by being in a room with it, and who had never made a choice in his life that was not for duty. Now Lysa wielded Jon's absence like a tool, and used the veil, like it was a curtain she could draw open and closed at her whim. He touched the white wax with his thumb, and thought of Sweet Robin's small body, and the way grief made fools of parents in both soft and cruel ways. He thought of Petyr Baelish's careful, smiling face. He thought of Renly, green as spring grass and twice as proud. He thought of Robert's laugh that had been a refuge once, when the world had been young and two boys had promised to hold it together between them. and now was a wave that knocked him from his feet. He set the letter down and breathed as a man who had learned to love the smell of pine and snow sometimes cannot breathe in heat. He told himself that whatever Lysa did in the Vale mattered less than the simple, terrible truth he had come to in tangled pages and a queen's mirrored face. The king's children were not the king's. That knowledge was a sword he could not sheathe no matter how he longed to. He could brandish it and cut himself or hide it and shame his house, or try to use it to carve a narrow path where law could walk and not slip. He closed his eyes and saw a girl with hair like Oberyn's summer and a straight back as she walked away from Winterfell to a fate he had made because he had promised honor he would be faithful to it. Sansa, he murmured, and then Arya, with a pang of a different kind. Sansa sat in some courtly corner now, shining like a coin, making herself small and smooth in a city of angles. Arya was probably dirty and happy, and in danger every hour she was alive. He called for Tomard. He called for Vayon Poole, and delivered orders in a voice that did not waver. He called for parchment and wrote to Lysa in a hand learned in a colder country, where ink froze too if you did not warm it. He wrote what he could write, that she should think more of the boy and less of the world's games, that Jon would not have lifted the Vale into any man's quarrel without the realm's need, that he, Eddard, would do his duty by law and by the king. He did not write the truth he could not afford to set to paper. He did not write that he had begun to lay lines with the city watch, to place men in the shadows who would stand when the sun came up and other men had fallen. He did not write that he feared for Robert in a way that made his knuckles whiten on a goblet, and that he feared for Sansa in a way that made him want to pull down the city stone by stone and carry her home wrapped in a wool cloak. In the Red Keep's lesser gardens, Sansa Stark sat with Septa Mordane and a cluster of other girls beneath a lattice-work of shade, where grapes swelled in the heat. The air smelled of baked brick and burnt sugar. Somewhere a cook had spilled his patience and his syrup both. The girls had taken to calling this place the Queen's Walk because they imagined themselves a procession of queens when they crossed it, their skirts skimming leaves, their fingers trailing along silvered vines. Sansa liked to think of herself as a queen because the thought was a song, and songs were nicer than much of what the city offered. She held a piece of needlework she had not moved in 15 minutes. In her mind, though, she had stitched a scene brighter than the dyed silk in her lap. A summer court where green banners fluttered, and knights bowed with smiles and swords, and a queen whose hair the sun loved. She thought of Lord Renly as she had seen him at the tourney, laughing with Sir Loras, his green cloak a fall of leaves. She thought of Prince Joffrey, and how his mouth could become a knife when no one was looking, but how he walked like a prince in stories when everyone was. She had begun to learn that both truths could live in a person, and that sometimes songs lied by leaving complicated things out. Septa Mordane interrupted the stitches in her mind with a soft clearing of her throat. "Your stitches are loose, my lady." "They are not loose," Sansa said without looking. "They are airy. The flowers will seem more natural if they have room around them." "Air is not the same as sloth," the Septa said. But she smiled, because Sansa had been clever in the way cleverness was allowed. Across the garden, Renly Baratheon walked with Sir Loras Tyrell. Girls noticed the way their shadows overlapped, and then did not. Sansa watched them because she could not help watching things that made a good tale. She did not hear words, only laughter, and the shape laughter made. Renly glanced her way, and his smile warmed by a candle flame's worth. That was enough to set a small sweetness loose in her chest. She wondered what it would be to marry a man who laughed, and who meant it when he did. Then she remembered Joffrey's pale hair, and the way it glowed in sunlight. She told herself that a story could become the world if one wished hard enough. She told herself she was good at wishing. At Runestone, where the sea smashed itself into stony coves with the patience of an old enemy, Jon Royce's horn called men to the yard until the yard was a forest of spears and voices. The banner of the bronze disc lifted in the sea wind like a slow coin. Ravens had flown from other holds too. Other horns answered. Sir Lyn Corbray rode in with a face that looked like hunger had wooed it, and won. He made a show of dismounting so that his Valyrian steel sword slid free, a thumb's width with a sound like memory being unsheathed. "Lady Lysa bids us go to Storm's End," Lyn said, not expecting contradiction. "She bids," Jon said. He gave the man that thin smile. "Men give snakes they mean to step around." The veil moves because the veil decides to move. If Our Lady makes a wise choice, we are all the more pleased. Corbet's lips went pale and then red again. I am pleased to please, he said. He did not sound pleased. Lord Grafton has galleys near enough fitted for a royal fleet. The sisters will lend ferries at twice their worth. We will be on the water before a fortnight is finished. Then? The veil is not a fish, Jan said dryly. We are men who make Iron Ring and Leather Creek. We will step aboard when we are ready, and not a heartbeat sooner. Rushing a horse to the sea only teaches him to fear it. With respect, Lynn said, meaning none. If we wait, we sail into a storm with no helm. The capital thinks and plots even as we stand here exchanging proverbs. The capital plots whether we stand, sit, or hang, Jan said. He lifted his hand, and the men behind him quieted like a tide, flattening. Hear me, men of the Vale. We go to the sea. We fly to Storm's End. We go not as raiders but as a host that can stand a siege and break a march. We keep good order, and we remember that stone does not float. If ships go down, horses drown. That is a shame. That is a loss. That is a lesson older than any of us. So we tie them well. We feed them right, and we sing to them if singing. He turned to Robur. Choose your best lads, he said. If Renly Baratheon finds you to his liking, he will put you to tasks and then to trials. Do not blush. Do not boast. Do your duty as if there were a winter wind at your back. Bow. Robur's eyes shone. Ay, he said again, and this time the word had weight. At the Eyrie, Lysa slept in the late morning and woke in the afternoon, with the particular dry-mouthed guilt of those who have slept when others have worked. She dressed in fine blue and silver, and sat in the solar with her back straight and her hands folded just so. She received Sir Nestor's runner and read his list of provisioners, names and measures and numbers that would have bored her once. She imagined those sacks of grain and that salt beef being loaded into ships with gulls screaming above, and felt a satisfaction, domestic and fierce, like seeing cupboards full before winter. Maester Coleman hovered with a cup and a look that begged indulgence. The boy coughed twice this morning, he said gently. It is the dust, perhaps. The air from the high galleries, the damp rising. Then keep the damp down, Lysa snapped. And then, at the look that crossed his face, softened her tone with a practice she had learned. I am tired, Coleman. Forgive me. I have been writing all night. Perhaps I am not fit for company. Coleman's mouth quirked. Our Lady is fit for anything she must do, he said. He offered the cup again. She took it and sipped. Bitter herbs clung to her tongue. The taste made her think of Petter's letters. Dry, clean, clever. A raven from King's Landing, Coleman added too casually. From your sister's husband. She held out her hand like a queen granting an audience and took the roll of parchment. Eddard's hand looked like it had been carved with a knife from ice. She read with her face arranged to show little. When she finished, she smiled a smile that was made of brittle things. Lord Eddard counsels caution, she said, as if the words were wine to be tasted. He writes of John. He writes of the boy. She folded the letter carefully and set it down. He does not know what the lions know. She added softly, looking down at her hands where the veins showed faint beneath the skin. He did not lie with Petter when we were children. He did not have to learn the taste of fear in the dark like milk. Ben-Awen, Coleman, who had known her since before John died, and sometimes thought he had known her all his life, bowed and withdrew. On the King's Road south of the Vale's eastern marches, dust rose in slow veils from a caravan of horse dealers and cheese sellers heading to Duskendale. Along the verge, a thin man in a dun cloak, with a smile like a closed purse, watched them pass and counted wagons. He was not dressed as a Lannister, but his eyes carried lions in their corners like bloodlines. He saw the banners in the east and smelled the movement of grain and leather. He went to a guarded place that evening and wrote a careful note that began, "The falcons stir, and do not pretend otherwise." By morning, his bird had the rhythm of wings and was lost in the pale sky. There were other watchers. A sisterman with a face like weather noted which ships in Gulltown had been marked with chalk, and told his cousin to keep the ferries near, but not too near. A hedge knight, thinking to sell his sword, observed that the Vale Knights were polishing theirs, and decided he would do better to sell it in a place with more ale and fewer rules. A boy in Old Anchor put his hand on the flank of a grey gelding, and felt the heat of horseflesh, and told himself he would go too, though no one had asked him. At dusk on the second day after Liza's ravens, the first of the Arryn banners descended the stone road in a procession that made the cold iron of the bloody gate feel warmer. White silk more often than not, falcons flying on blue. The men beneath them wore the varied livery of their small lords, but everywhere there was the homely, ugly sameness of war-making. The smell of oil, the sound of leather notching, the weight of iron. A company from Ironawaks had carved oaken leaves along the edge of their shields. A company from Strongsong had bells tied into their horses' manes that jingled in small, cheerful betrayal with every step. Children from the farms came to watch, and were cuffed back by mothers who could not keep from looking themselves. There were old men in that march who had been boys when Jon Arryn had called his banners for the last time. There were boys who had never slept beneath canvas away from their mothers. There were men who had never been farther than the next valley over. There were men who had once slept at the bottom of rookeries so thick with droppings their hair had turned white, and who now bore spears because someone had needed numbers. There were singers who had tuned their instruments and already half-formed songs to flatter the heroes, whatever would be asked of them. There were wives who kissed husbands as if their mouths could anchor them to the earth. There were widows who did not weep because tears were a waste of salt they might need later. The Vale, in the slow rhythm of that host, moved. 2 days later, the first ranks reached Gulltown. The harbor's shape was that of a cupped hand. The fingers curled around water that gathered ships like toys, and floated them where men pointed. The air clung with tar and fish and smoke, and beneath those, a clean, cold scent of the sea that no man could sell. Grafton stood on the seawall in a blue cloak heavy enough to stand up to the wind and watched the pennants approach the city gates, like embroidery being brought to pattern. He made the signs for welcome, for hurry, for caution. He had learned them as a boy, watching storms roll in from the east. Guildmasters watched too, and merchants, and the sort of men who become rich by knowing when to look and when to close their eyes. Grafton's men had marked hulls, and those hulls had been eased into new berths with curses and laughter and rope-burned hands. Sisterman ferries bobbed in the outer roads like stubborn goats. A Mirish galley, with a prow carved into a dragon woman's breast, watched this provincial bustle with disdain, and then made itself useful for a fee that would make a hungry man blink. Horses snorted and rolled their eyes at the stink and the sound. Good grooms whispered to them, and bad ones shook them by the bits. Men piled barrels of water in dangerous towers and moved them again when a harbormaster swore at them, and then moved them a third time because a night squire had claimed the spot for his lord's palfreys. Biscuits, hard as honest truth, disappeared into sacks. Lemons rolled like bright stones. 2 Carthene traders got into an argument with a very small woman from the Fingers about the price of brine shrimp, and were separated by a priestess of the Mother with a hand that had smacked many a fool into good behavior. By the 6th day, the sea outside Gulltown was a chaos of intention. The first ships put off with a cheer that started on shore, and went with them like a blessing, and then like a leash. Men who had never been to sea stared at the line where the water turned from the green of a deep tarn to the blue of a sky turned sideways. Old oarsmen spat in their hands and eyed the weather with the intimacy of men who know when they are being lied to. Robar Royce stood on a deck that tilted beneath his boots and laughed aloud at the feeling, because it was new, and because he could. He had a fool's grace with him that day, a sense that the world would step aside if he asked it politely. He could not know that storms walked under blue like wolves beneath sheep. He only knew that the oars bit and the sail bellied, and the gulls screamed their approval, and that a man's chest could expand enough to let in a very large horizon. He went to the rail and looked back at the city. Gulltown narrowed with a painter's trick as they pulled away. Sharp lines softening into a wash of color. The falcons on the masthead still looked proud at that distance, but smaller, as if pride itself could be carried like a pennant, and then set down. He thought of his father, who would be mustering the second wave. He thought of Lynn Corbray, whose smile was a question that never had a true answer. He thought of Renly Baratheon with all the simplicity of a lad who wanted a story to be good, and for the prince in it to be the sort who returned smiles with boons. Night fell slow, and then all at once, the way it does on water, the men made their little camps out of nothing, talking low as if noise could spill them into the sea. A harp came out from somewhere and made soft, silly music that could not carry far in the wind. The moon was a shard. Robar lay with his back to the mast and watched it climb like a blade toward his ribs, and decided not to be superstitious this once. On the third morning, a ring of dolphins ran with them for an hour, and made even the oldest oarsman grin. On the fifth, a squall ran in with a laugh and slapped 3 ships aside to remind men that wood floats by the grace of old stories, and physics both. On the 7th, Storm's End came up out of a haze, as if a god had pushed it through the blue with a thumb. It looked just as the song said, and nothing like them. It crouched low and wide, a great hunch of stone facing the sea with a contempt so stable, it felt like love. The walls stooped into the wind, as if they had found a way to remain standing by agreeing to lean forever. The surf threw itself at those walls, and collapsed into white lace, as if the castle were a dark wedding that would never end. Men on the decks took off their helms unthinking, as men do before things older than memory. Lord Renly had not yet ridden from the capital. He would soon. Letters had gone and come and gone. The Tyrells had begun to put their weight upon their stirrups, without yet lifting from their saddles. Stannis had begun to grind his teeth in a rhythm that made his jaw ache. Cersei had begun to count things she could not have, which always left her very angry. The City Watch had begun to wonder why honest men always ended up with bruises. The king had begun to cough in a way that turned laughter into a wheeze. But from the decks of the Vale Fleet, all of that was a story happening somewhere else. Here, there was only stone and sea, and the way the wind stole your hat and your certainty. Upon a high headland a mile from the castle, a green banner flapped in salt spray. Beneath it, men in studded leather and in mail watched through horns, and argued amiably about whether the ships were white as gulls or gray as rain. One of them, a man with a scar across his lip and a family in the village behind the dunes, squinted and said, "Alkins on a blue field. I'll be buggered backward. The Vale." Another spat into the wind and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then our Lord's letters were not words thrown into the wind to see if they flew. They flew. Then the first of the Gulltown galleys hove to. Oars shipped, ropes thrown, curse and answer all one music. Men shouted names. The surf tried to steal them, and failed that day. Robar Royce went ashore in a leather jerkin that had known rain, and in a grin that had known better. He set his boots on the pebbles, and felt them shift treacherously under his weight. Laughed again for the sheer pleasure of not falling, and then finally sobered, because the castle was looking at him, and at all of them. He told himself that walls could not look. He did not quite believe it. "Robar, son of Jan," said a Stormlander with a voice like oak rubbed with oil. "You bring falcons?" "I bring what I can carry," Robar said. "More comes behind. Bronze Jan rides with the second wave. Lord Grafton empties his harbor with the third. I have letters for Lord Renly from the Lady of the Eyrie and from our steward, and from Lord Grafton, and from every petty lord who wished to sign his name near a thing that will be told." The Stormlander showed his teeth. He's not waiting in the castle to read them. He rides even now with 200 lances to make sure his hair is admired while he works. You'll catch him if you run on a fast horse and if the gods fancy the show. Nender. Robar thought of running. He thought of horses. He thought of the sea's long push and the letter sealed in blue wax in his pouch. He touched it, then drew his hand away like a man who reaches for a loaf in a market and remembers that others are hungry too. "We'll wait," he said. He'll return with the sunset to drink wine and make plans and listen to songs about his jawline. We'll hand him letters then, and we'll have to repeat half of what we say because the harper will be loud. It will be fine. Betty. The Stormlander laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. You speak like a man who has not yet been disappointed by a plan. Enjoy it while it lasts. In King's Landing, Pettier Baelish sat in a cool room, with shutters that made the sun into slivers, and counted things with his mouth turned in the smallest of smiles. He counted coins, yes, and favors, and the number of steps between here and there, and the number of times a man would visit a woman before he stopped bringing flowers. He counted the letters he had sent and their likely arrival, and the men who would open them, and the expressions their faces would make as they read. He counted the chances, which were slippery, and the risks, which were heavy, and the times he had seen a thing almost happen, and then not. He did not count honor. He did not count love. Those were numbers that refused to sit still on any slate he had learned to use. He had set the falcons to fly because it had pleased him to imagine them wheeling where they had been tethered. He had whispered to Lysa because he could, and because the shape of her need still fit his hand. He had offered Renly a banquet laid with knives, and told himself that if Renly cut his meat, and not his fingers, that would be a merrier supper than most. He had watched Eddard Stark move through the court like a well-made axe. Simple, clean, made for splitting things that preferred not to be divided. He had decided in the clear, cold place where he made such determinations that axes were useful for wood and dangerous for men, and that he would rather work with knives and silks and fire. Outside the shuttered room, the city ripened. The heat made sweet things sweeter and foul things worse. Men spoke in low voices in wine-sink corners and in too loud ones in markets where the sellers were tired of haggling. A boy was knocked down by a cart and got up with blood on his lip and a fist like a big boy's because he had been made to be older by a wheel. A woman cried into her apron for no reason her husband could see. The Red Keep's shadow slid across the cobbles as the sun moved, and beggars and lords alike stepped aside when the shadow fell across them, because even a cool patch of road can carry a chill. On the last night before Renly ran south, he stood alone on a balcony and watched the river scar the city with its glitter. He did not often stand alone. He did it now because the air at dawn tasted different, like water pulled from a deeper well, and because he could allow himself truths with no ears around. He thought of Robert, who had been a mountain and now was a hill. He thought of Stannis, who had been a cliff and now was a cliff with a crack in it. He thought of himself as a handsome tree whose branches made good shade. He wondered if men would love him less if he wore a crown and smiled less in order to keep it on his head. He told himself that he would show them a king who laughed and made laughing safe. He told himself that he would make order without breaking too many of the things that made delicious disorder. He told himself many things he had learned the sophistication to half believe. When the sun's rim bit the river, he went to wake Loras with a touch to his shoulder that was lighter than most. Loras woke smiling because he had taught his body to. They made their preparations with the efficiency of men who like to put on a show of being casual. They did not say the words that would have sounded foolish. They did not say the ones that would have sounded brave. The city watched them go. Some cheered, some spat, and then smiled to show they had not really meant it. Some lifted bowls, some lifted curses. The Red Keep watched them go with windows that looked like blind eyes. The Vale fleet slid along the coast like a thought that had found language. At every headland, new wind came down off chalk and gorse. In every small harbor, a child on a breakwater pointed with a stick and shouted the name of a lord badly. And a father corrected him with the right one, and a mother cuffed the father and told the child to go fetch water. A dolphin leapt, a sail split and was mended while a man sang about lemons and a girl who had promised to wait and would not. At evening, the sea turned to beaten copper and men's faces to old coins, and then to mystery. At dawn, it was blue glass again, and they were true again. Storm's End took them. The castle allowed itself to be called friend, the way a very large dog allows a child to tug its ear. Robar gave Renly the letters when Renly came back with dust in his hair, and a grin that had made 3 village girls put hands to their throats when they saw it. Renly read 2, glanced at 3, and made a joke about the handwriting in a 4th. He clapped Robar's shoulder with a hand that had the strength of a real man and the lightness of a boy, and said words so warm that Robar, already bent further. That night, men drank in the long hall that smelled of meat and salt and old campaigns. Musicians tried to make fiddles sound like the sea. Squires fell asleep against pillars and woke with straw in their hair. Lords talked quietly in corners and loudly at tables, and tried to make their quiet sound like wisdom and their loud sound like courage. The wind moaned in a vent high in the wall that the masons had stopped from whistling with a handful of pebbles. Somewhere, a woman cried for a reason no one else knew and was comforted in a language older than words. Loras watched Renly hold the room like a cup and felt pride and an ache, and then only pride because it was easier to carry. In the morning, plans were made. Storm's End would be the hearth. The Vale would be the knife. Highgarden would be the golden plate that drew eyes. The city would be the roast, and men would pretend they were not hungry even as they smelled it. Lists unfurled like banners. Stores to be ordered, messengers to be sent, a very particular goldsmith in Bitterbridge to be paid a visit, a septon with a strong voice to be secured, a singer who would lean into praise without making the subject seem ridiculous. Back in the Vale, Lysa stood again by the moon door. She did not open it. The cold from the stone around it seeped into her bones like a second, different blood. She did not fear the drop. She feared the other kind of falling, the one in which choices were a stair, and each step was an admission that there had been a step before, and that you had taken it, and that now there would be another. She closed her eyes and thought of a boy's soft sleep. She thought of Petir's promise curled around that sleep like a cat. "Bring me ink," she said without turning. "There is more to write." Down the high road, through the bloody gate, past Sir Nestor's tally and Jan Royce's cool eye, the Vale's second wave rolled like a patient river. Men with their hair braided with copper wire. Men with old runes carved into the caps of their spears by grandfathers who had forgotten what the letters meant. Thin boys whose swords were too bright and thick men whose swords had bites taken from them. A woman riding side saddle with a face like a decomposed angel, guarding two younger brothers with the concentration of a hawk. A pair of brothers arguing about whether their father had loved one more or both the same. A lord too proud of his new surcoat. A common man proud to be walking where lords walk. An old greyhound asleep beneath a wagon who would wake only when the sea made new noises. The world had begun to move in 20 places at once and to think itself clever for it. Across rivers, in halls, on decks, in beds and on battlements, men and women arranged feelings as if they were hearth logs. Each told themselves a story that made sense. Each hoped the end would be kind. The wind did not care how this chapter closed. The wind only moved and carried flags and pushed ships and lifted a hair from a man's brow so that a woman saw him and thought he looked well and then moved on. Bronzion's second wave reached Gulltown beneath a sky the color of unpolished pewter. Grafton's harbormaster had improved since the first madness. The ropes went where they should. The barrels rolled where they must. The oars found their banks like hands finding old tools. Jan himself stepped aboard a galley that had belonged to a merchant who had objected and then had smiled when paid. He stood at the prow because he liked to see where he was going and because men liked to look at him and feel steadier. He watched Gulltown shrink and thought of his father and of his son and of a time when he had believed the world would bend to old names. Storm's End, he said to no one, naming a destination and also a weather's temper. Let us see what a boy makes of our coming. And the ships went, as ships do, with less grace than poets pretend, and more determination than many men ever find. They went into weather that had not yet been born, toward men who had not yet decided who they would be when the talk ended, and the swords came out, toward women who would bear them or bury them or both. They went with their banners rolled against spray, with their horse lines checked twice, with their biscuit counted and then recounted. They went with songs half made and fears half named. In the capital, Eddard Stark folded Lysa's letter and set it in a drawer with other heavy things and hoped his hands would remain steady enough to take them out when the time came. In a quiet room, Petyr Baelish smiled at a thought that was his alone. In a scented solar, Cersei Lannister listened to a report that had the word Gulltown in it, and felt the skin along her jaw tighten with a new resolve. In a sept, a girl lit a candle and prayed to the mother for a husband who would love her. She had never seen a ship. In a field, a boy practiced with a wooden sword while his father counted sheep in his head and told himself both numbers would be enough. Above it all, the moon walked in daylight veiled thin, and then at night it hung in the sky like the white half-coin that it was. The mountains of the moon held the Eyrie up as they had always done. The sea cuffed storms end as it had always done. Between those old certainties, men and women made new things out of old desires, and called them plans. When Renly reached the headland west of Storm's End for the first time with the Vale host at his back, the dawn had the color of new iron. The grass carried beads of water like a jeweler's careless table. He reined in and looked out over the sea, as if it belonged to him because he could not quite help it. Beside him, Laura sat very still, the way a great cat sits when it is thinking about pouncing, but is not yet sure on whom. "Look," Renly said, and pointed with his chin so that he would not have to remove his hand from the reins. The ships were pushing white along their bows, lines like scratches drawn by some god's fingernail. "Balcons, Balcons," Loras agreed, and then, with a long breath that made him human again, added, "Friends?" Renly smiled. It was a large smile, and a true one. "For now," he said. Honest because the day was beautiful, and because beauty sometimes makes men feel brave enough to tell the truth. He turned his horse and rode down to the beach, where the waves flattened themselves into dirty lace. Robar Royce met him with a flourish that was a little too fine and a bow that was not too deep. Jon Royce stepped ashore with his weight in his heels and his eyes on Renly's, measuring, not afraid. Lyn Corbray came off another gangplank like a sword taken down from a wall. Men watched and judged, and thought they were not, and pretended their judgments were not desires dressed in thought. Renly opened his arms as if to embrace them, and embraced the air instead. "My lords," he said, it ringing as some men's voices do when they tell the truth, and tell lies with equal warmth. "Welcome to Storm's End. Welcome to the beginning." Jon inclined his head without surrender. "We shall see whether it is a beginning or the middle of something that started before either of us was born," he said. Renly laughed. "I am content to call it what you like, provided we call it ours." They turned then to look toward the long walls whose knees bent into the wind, and then beyond them, to the city to the north where stone and rumor stacked themselves, and to another city in the mind where plans were real. The waves hissed, the gulls cried. A horse shook itself all over and made a sound like leather applauding, and in the stillness between those things, the wind carried a promise as empty and as full as wind always is. "Yai. K." Renly made a small gesture, and men moved in arcs behind him. The sweep of green cloaks and the creak of leather carrying the suggestion of ceremony without admitting to it. The surf spoke in sibilance. The day would be fair. Even a Stormlander could feel it in the air when the wind let its shoulders droop. A gull dropped something that might once have been a crab, and a boy ran to look as if treasure had fallen from the sky. "Courtenay Penrose holds the castle for my brother," Renly said, as if he were naming the weather, not complaining about it. "He is stubborn in the manner of good men and a better castellan than singer. He will offer us courtesy and a hard limit." "Hard limits make good allies," Jon said. "One knows where to stand." Renly's grin was quick, appreciative. "Then stand with me a while. There is much to set in motion that cannot be written on parchment without making cowards of it." Loras brought horses. Someone had thought to give the Vale lords sure-footed mounts and sure-footed squires to mind them. They rode up the strand and then inland along a goat path that had learned to pretend it was a road, through heather that bowed and rose and bowed again, as if greeting every rider in turn. The ground climbed, the sea fell away behind them, and then they came upon a brow of land where the whole shoulder of Shipbreaker Bay showed like a giant's rib. Renly drew rein and gave the day its minute. A thing can be owned by naming it or by looking at it long enough. He looked and was satisfied. "We will not quarter within the walls," he said at last, mild but not yielding. Storm's End is Stannis by right and mine to visit, not mine to keep. I am not here to steal my brother's shadow. I had not thought you were, Jon said. The words were simple, but he put them down like stones in a ford. Loras flicked a glance toward the older man, perhaps expecting a barb, and finding only iron. We will raise pavilions there, beyond the old salt road, Renly went on, pointing with a half-raised hand. The ground is higher, the drainage decent, a stream close by that runs clear even in a dry week. The villages at Griffin's Roost and Parchments are loyal to Stannis, and to me when I bring coin and fair dealing. We will buy what we can and requisition only what we must, and pay for the requisitions in silver, stamped with my stag, and with Lord's, Grafton, and Aaron's falcon, cut into the rim. Men like to keep coins that have two truths pressed into them. Men like to keep coins, Lyn Corbray said, a smile sullying the words. His hand lay near the pale hilt at his hip, the sword that had made men talk about him in a tone they did not admit to liking. What truths they show are for the songs. That as well, Renly allowed freely. I have a use for songs. They are the only banners that do not rot in rain. They rode down to the new ground, where lines were already being paced and marked with stakes and red-tipped wands. A young Stormlander sergeant delivered himself of a crisp report in a voice that would have done credit to the Red Keep. Jon listened as if hearing timbers being fitted. Robert drank everything with his eyes. By sunset, the first skeleton of a camp stood. Cook fires staked and drawn against wind with slate ringstones. Latrine trenches placed where the slope would not poison men's sleep. Horse lines pegged with room for panic. A square set aside for armorers who would turn out nails and straps for the 1,000 little breakages that a day's service demands. Renly walked it as a man will walk the perimeter of a house he means to live in, touching a rope here, lifting a corner of canvas there, asking a half question to make sure the man who answered owned the task and would defend it from lazy hands. Courtnay Penrose came down from the great gate near dusk under a banner that sighed like an old man. The orange and blue of his house, the pale quills, the crossed inkhorns. He wore mail beneath his cloak and courtesy above it. His face was not beautiful, which helped a man trust him. "My Lord Renly," he said, bowing in the old style. "My Lord Royce, you bring the sea with you today. I hope to borrow a little of your land," Renly answered. "Light. Not the castle. I have told my friends here that Storm's End is my brother's hearth. I only want a stool by it." "Bam?" Penrose's mouth twitched, which in another man might have been a smile. "A stool will be found, and penned goats, if your men will swear to keep dogs leashed. Goats do not love soldiers, nor do milkmaids. Give me both and I will set Loras to mind them," Renly said. "Wicked as a boy stealing apples. Hay has a gentle hand. I have seen that hand break a man's guard like a door slat," Penrose returned dryly, and then the face did smile, just enough to make the air warmer. "Buy what you need within reason. We will not be stripped. The harvest is good along Wendwater this year, and better in my cousin's lands to the south. Your quartermasters will speak with mine." The wind dipped between them and straightened its back again. Renly nodded, simple, and the bargain was struck without anyone needing to pretend it had not been. That night they ate in the lee of a chalk knoll, where the wind broke and lay down like a tired hound. The sea sang and the fire made its own notes. Men's speech softened under smoke and meat. Robar found himself beside a Stormlander knight with a beard full of salt and a story about a tide that had come up and taken a horse, calm as a thief. Jon sat with Courtnay Penrose and traded the sort of remarks that carry the whole weight of two men's histories in them. Later, they stopped speaking and simply shared heat. Loras made a jest that turned a circle of men into friends for an hour. Renly moved from knot to knot and left a warmer shadow each place he had stood. Beyond the circle of light, the heather bowed to a wind that could not be tamed. Stars came. The cloud rack slid aside. One of the sisters' ferries crossed the dark line of the bay, with lanterns at prow and stern, swinging, patient. The sisters always had the patience of men who knew the price of a channel. Far out, a fire flash showed where a galley signaled to another. A brief private word between ships. The camp slept in ragged pieces and woke as if it had never slept at all. With dawn, the days began to stack. Labor made its own calendar. The Vale's second wave arrived and put in without incident. Grafton's officers found themselves praised and cursed and worked like slaves. Bronzion's tent went up where the land gave granite beneath the turf. Men like him set weight where stone would hold it. Lyn Corbray's people fussed over their lord's pavilion as if it had been a bride. The sword on his hip minded none of it. Robar took to riding the ridgelines morning and evening, learning the land with his body until he knew where a horse would stumble, and where the ground would surprise him by being kinder than it looked. A rhythm emerged. Drill in the forenoons and the hour before dusk. Shoeing and harness in the heat of the day. The constant ballet of water casks, always leaking faster than a man's hopes. Letters arrived and were answered. Lists grew, and with them, the particular thoughts that make plans more than fine words. A carpenter from the Fingers, notched and scarred, marked trees inland, and sent gangs to fell them with the permission of a Tarth bailiff, who had the grace to be pleased that the coin for the timber was weighed, rather than merely counted. A woman from Evenfall Hall came and spoke for her lord about hay. What it cost in the second week of a windless spell. How many stacks would survive a squall. Whether the outlying farms could spare the last cutting if winter decided to come early. Jon listened. Renly listened and flirted, and then listened again. Loras learned the woman's name and used it when she came back, which cost nothing and bought a little more patience than coin would have. Messages ran up the Mander into the Fatlands. Neat, pretty missives with the Tyrell rose pressed bright into wax, others with a stag, now a falcon in Arryn blue riding in the ring. Mace Tyrell opened them while he broke his fast on eggs, poached in wine, and a ham glazed with quince, and told his steward that he had expected as much. Paxter Redwine, who knew ships the way a harper knows the shapes under his fingers, wrote a careful answer about weather and blockade and the cost of naval courtesy. Randall Tarley, Flint under velvet, sent a clerk with a rolled map and the blunt opinion that if they meant to do anything, they should do it hard and soon. Mathis Rowan proposed that hard things went better when men were not hungry. Marguerite Tyrell took a letter into her solar and sat a while with her hands folded on its folded skin, thinking as a gardener thinks, in layers and seasons, and with a patience that has nothing to do with waiting. She had seen Renly laugh, and it had pleased her. She had seen him look past men and toward an imagined horizon, and that had pleased her more, because it meant he had a road in him, and not merely a hall. She asked her maid to fetch the green velvet that made the light flattering, and then wrote her own note, small and wicked and generous. All at once, as a girl might tie a ribbon and a bell to a cat, she meant to keep, in the red keep, shadow-bleached color from the world at midday, and returned it rudely toward evening. Eddard Stark labored in his melancholy way, turning facts until they gave him their faces. The king came and went, roaring or wheezing as mood and drink required. Varys flowed like water downhill. Pettyr smiled as if this were a comedy worth the price of admission. Eddard took his measure against both, and found no purchase. He began to place men on the board that was not a board. Men with honest faces and less honest needs. He sent a quiet watch to an alewife whose husband had left her a small house that sat on a certain alley. He paid a jailer's cousin to tell him which cell doors had swelled in the last damp and could not be made to close without a second pair of hands. He listened when a boy named Jax with a scar on his lip swore he had seen a queen's brother ride in a place where a lord's son had no right to be after midnight. He wrapped those small truths around the big one he could not yet say. Cersei Lannister measured her days by reversals. If she had a letter by breakfast that pleased her, she learned by noon that someone else had one more pleasing still. If she left a room having one, she found that the room had changed when she turned back to it. She would not admit that the city itself disliked her, the way a crowd sometimes dislikes a player because he reminds them that the play must end. She counted the gulls that came to the river as if numbers could make them different birds. She watched her son practice at sword with men who had been born to serve other boys, and saw glory the way a starving man sees roast meat, fully, but through a haze of pain. On the third week, after the first veil sails showed off the Stormland's head, Renly rode inland with a light company, Jon Royce beside him by insistence and not by courtesy. They went to Parchments, where the Penroses kept their books and their kine. and to a little meadow beyond where the ground rose gently like a breath being taken. There, under alder and ash, they spoke for the first time of marriage, as if it were a siege plan, and not a sacrament. "Astonish them," Renly said, letting the sun paint his hair and knowing what it did for him. "Before they have measured you, be larger than their measure. I would have rode to Highgarden and thrown myself before Mace like a supplicant with a feast to follow, if the world were a different world. But it loves shows. Let it have one. The East is with me. The South will not wait to be last at such a table." "Astonish is a fine word," Jon said. He did not look astonished. If you pile too many fine words up, men begin to notice that they can be set on fire. Renly's grin slanted. "I have water enough to put out 2 fires," he said. "After that, I will learn to be more careful, like a man who has singed his beard." He sobered then, because he could, and because he liked to show Jon he could. "I mean to be king," he said. "I was not born to it. I was born to make the halls bright and to make men think better of their supper. I know this. But I mean to be king because I will be good at it, and because I love the way a hall feels when it is happy. Robert is a storm that equals this castle's name. Stannis is a cliff. You can break yourself against him, and he will not even notice the bleeding. I am a tree, Lord Royce. Men like shade. They build under it." "Mean?" Jon let the quiet stand a while. He looked sideways along the meadow and watched an ant labor over a blade of grass with a piece of leaf on its back, bigger than itself. "You will be opposed," he said. The most obvious thing in the world made new by being spoken as if it were deserving of care. "By your brother. By the lions. By the North, if the North decides that law is a better blanket than comfort." "Then you." "I will be opposed," Renly agreed cleanly. "I have always been opposed. It has not kept me from eating." "You will need more than a merry hunger," Jon said. "I have more," Renly said, with the slight impatience of a man who wants to show his strength, but will not be caught flexing in a mirror. "I have men who will do as I say because they like the way their names sound when I say them. I have coin that will not stink when it is counted. I have a face that makes doors open. Nan. And when the door is an iron one set in a wall of stone?" Jon asked. Renly's answer was a small private thing. "Then I will find the gatehouse and smile at the man who has the keys until he says yes. And if he will not, I will build a ladder." "You will break your neck on ladders," Jon said. His tone was dry as the heel of a loaf. "I will climb older than you are," Renly said cheerfully. "And I will bring my friends." Then the day folded around them again, a hawk crying high and away, the distant thump of hooves where a patrol crossed a hollow, the smell of trampled grass sweetening. The world offers such interludes in which men make decisions and pretend the wind is listening. From Dragonstone, where Blackstone drank light and returned nothing but its own dark Stannis Baratheon, wrote a letter in a hand that would have scared ink if ink were a thing that could be afraid. Maester Cresson coughed and put down sand to fix the words that did not need fixing. Davos Seaworth stood with a hat in his hand and a feeling in his chest that belonged to a younger man. "The veil will follow Renly," Stannis said without looking up, as if pronouncing sentence on a guilty loaf. "They will like the taste of saffron on their meat. The Tyrells will bring a cart of it and a cart of lambs to eat it on." Renly was always a boy who thought that empty plates ought to be persuaded with smiles. "Smiles can fill a hall," Davos ventured. "They can carry a man through a night." "Smiles cannot cross a sea," Stannis said. "Ships cross seas. Men who know how to keep them from burning in the first squall cross seas. Renly has not one ship of his own. He has borrowed everything in his life. He borrows the look of a king. He borrows the love of men who like to love things. He will borrow Storm's End if I turn my back." "Men too." "You have not turned your back," Davos said quietly. He saw the hard line of Stannis' mouth ease by a hair's width. The way a rope eased when a knot remembered it could be untied and then chose not to be. "Cresson," Stannis said, "write to Courtnay. Tell him to hold my castle with both hands. Tell him he may let my brother's men piss in the fields and not in the lanes. Tell him that if Renly smiles, he's to smile back and count the coins afterward. Mensawa. You might ride to Storm's End yourself, the old maester said. His voice was affectionate and insubordinate in the same breath. I might, Stannis said. I might also teach a sheep to sing. Men with eyes know that the king chokes on his cups, and that the dogs of the city are being fattened for a feast they will not enjoy. I am not far enough to be safe, and not near enough to be burned, as I was taught to be. For now, I send letters. For now I watch. For now, I count the men who will not love me, and decide whether their numbers can be made less by cutting throats, or by showing them their own reflection, and asking what they see. Crescent coughed again, a dry papery sound. Davos thought of his ship, Black Betha, and of the feel of a wheel under his hands. He thought of what it meant to be loyal to a man who would never give him easy thanks. He thought of Renly's laugh, which he had heard once at court and liked in spite of himself, and of Lysa Arryn's blue seal on a letter Davos had not read, but could imagine the shape of. He thought that the world was moving in many places, and that ships always arrived later than you wished, and sooner than you were ready for. The days around Storm's End lengthened into that kind of time soldiers learned to live inside. One thing after another. The same thing repeated until it made a new thing out of sameness. The Vale Knights took to the tilt-yard Robur, and Loras had staked out between a gorse-covered rise and a patch of sandy ground that could be raked smooth with half an hour, and 4 willing boys. There, lances shattered like dry bones. There, horses learned to step in the swale without putting a foot wrong. There, laughter and grudges grew, which is to say, fellowship. Robur Royce and Sir Loras Tyrell met 3 times in a week, and one of those was for courtesy. Robur had youth's honesty still. It made him quick to admire. Loras had speed like a wire pulled tight, and a detachment that made it beautiful. When they hit, the sound carried down the line like a cheer. The second bout took both off their seats. Robur found himself flat on his back with a sky too bright above him, and Loras' gauntleted hand, very matter-of-fact, reaching down to help him up. Robur took it and laughed, because the alternative was to be angry, and that felt like a heavy shirt. You ride like a prayer, he told Loras, dusting himself with efficient indignity. My mother prayed often enough, Loras said, unhooking his helm and shaking his hair so that it did a thing hair does when it knows eyes are on it. I expect some of it stuck. They were young enough to pretend 2 truths could sit in the same saddle. Rivalry and liking. Loras liked Robur's enthusiasm, which did not curdle into foolishness. Robur liked Loras' competence, which did not sour into contempt. Men noticed the liking and approved, because it is always easier to follow a road where the knights in front are laughing. Jan walked the lines and let himself be pleased by what could please a measured man. The way the cart settled into a habit that did not destroy their wheels. The way a watchfire ring was kept clean of brush. The way the water guard posted themselves where shadows reached and not where it was comfortable to stand. He kept a list in his head. Men who needed speaking to. Men who would do better if someone noticed their names. Men who would break when asked to bend. Lists are a kind of prayer as well. At the Eyrie, wind combed Lysa's hair, as she stood in the Lord's Declarance Gallery, and did not hear what the carved falcons in the stone had been trying to say for 300 years. She had slept and woken and slept again, with a dream pressed into the shape of a letter in her mind. Petter's hand wrote from a small, neat world, and always to the center of her, to where she believed her child lived when he was not coughing, to where she believed her girlhood had been taken, and could be returned if she did the right thing. She sent another raven, and then another. She told herself that each made her safer. She told herself she had always wanted safety, even as she pushed the veil toward a sea. Lady, Coleman said gently, in the tone of a man who has handled glassware all his life and never dropped a piece. It is not good for the boy to climb the high stairs every day. His chest. The boy will breathe, Lysa said, not turning. He has his mother. She closed her eyes and saw a falcon quilt wrapped around a small body, and beyond the quilt, a crown, and beyond the crown, Petter's smile. She told herself that these were not the same thing. In the alleys that run behind the Street of Steel, a man with a cobbler's hands and a thief's nose told a man with a butcher's arms and a poet's caution that the falcons had landed near Storm's End, and that Lord Renly had been seen riding with his Green Knight, with talk of roses following them like perfumes. The butcher grunted and said that roses had thorns. The cobbler laughed and said that thorns meant nothing to men who had never done a day's mending. They spat and parted. News in King's Landing breeds like rats. When the first Tyrell outriders came in sight across the smooth downs of the Reach and the rougher, hungry lands of the Marches, they rode with the casual arrogance of men who have always had a road set out for them. Colors bright, mounts sleek. The air around them full of a faint, sweet smell of lavender that was not there, you understood, but seemed to be because they made it so. They did not ride to Storm's End. They rode to Renly, wherever he had chosen to stand that day, as if he were a spring, and they an irrigation of grace. Mace Tyrell himself was not with them. He would arrive later, with wagons and trumpets, and a satisfaction that filled a hall like high smoke. The men he sent before him were better fitted for moving fast. Lord Rowan's messenger with the sly, quick wit, Sir Garland Tyrell with courtesy sharpened by practice, Paxter Redween's nephew with figures in his head like unspilled wine, and the Hightower nephew no one quite knew what to do with, earnest as a curate, glancing upward whenever he forgot he should be looking around him. They came to the Vale of Pavilions and were admitted by a set of gestures that said, "Welcome, and also, remember yourself." Renly received them with Loras at his right and Jan Royce at his left, a deliberate echo of a small council that did not yet exist. He made the shows that are necessary so that the necessities can be shown. The jest that made a stony Reachman's mouth twist and then unk not. The half-question that allowed a red wine to answer with a number. The compliment to Mathis Rowan's prudence that ensured his prudence would belong to this venture. Garland bowed and straightened and admired without being servile, which was a talent and a discipline both. "My lord," he said to Renly, "we bring the goodwill of Highgarden and a small tasting of its provision. The larger feast will follow, if the gods continue to favor our weather and the roads remain a thing men can travel. If they cease to be, we will make new roads," Renly said blithely. "Making roads is the work of fathers," Garland said with a glance like a smile toward Jon. "Sons like to ride them. You have both in your camp. I take heart from that. And now Wander." Jon's nod was not without warmth. The Reach had taught itself to be charming. The Vale had taught itself to be stubborn. They could share a table if the bridges between them were built each morning and checked each night. Food changed the air. Breeds came. The light, open-crumbed loaves that the Reach liked to boast of. Sour-crusted soldiers' rounds from the Vale. Salted beef, Stormlander goat. Cheeses wrapped in wax from Old Town. Green onions like ropes of emeralds. Lemons in baskets that showed off. Men who had been eating what they needed and calling it enough straightened on their blankets when a slice was passed that smelled of comfort. It is one thing to feed a host and another to feed its pride. Singers came too, tripping dutifully behind the carts. Renly did not mock them even in private. He knew their use. He had them play for the common sessions, not for the Lord's tent alone. A song is a right given by those who hear it. If you starve your men of such rights, they will take others to make the balance up. In the long light of a lavender evening, with gulls dropping like punctuation into the surf and the air full of flower dust, Robar found himself beside Loras again. The sun had burnished the younger Tyrell's hair to bronze. The horizon was a straight rule drawn in blue. "You will marry him," Robar said without embarrassment, "because youth gives a man the privilege of saying what is there to be said. Your sister." Loras did not look at him. "I will give her my blessing," he said, which was not the answer asked for, and yet was. Then he laughed softly at himself and amended, "I will give her my advice and my blessing, and then my silence. All three have their uses." "He will be a good king," Robar said, as if his saying so might tilt fate's scales a grain. "He will be a king that men enjoy," Loras said. "Sometimes that is the greater gift." "You do not say I am wrong," Robar persisted. "I have been wrong about many things," Loras said, "and right about some. I mean to be right about this for all our sakes. There is a kind of goodness that runs through a man like a vein. If you tap it right, the whole body takes warmth. Renly has that vein. He may spend it foolishly, He may be forced to spend it where he would rather not. But he has it. Robar accepted that, as if it were a sum done out for him and shown correct. The sea rolled in and out. A drummer boy somewhere miscounted and corrected himself quickly and went on. News travels in more ways than one. Sometimes a raven carries it. Sometimes the change in a man's walk does. The city began to feel the east and south looking at each other across a space that shortened by the hour. Men bought green and blue fabrics together without knowing why. Someone painted a falcon onto a stag's flank on a tavern sign, and then pretended it had always been that way. The royal steward found that the price of lemons had risen and made a note, not about lemons, but about change. And then the king went hunting. It had been coming for a fortnight, the way a boil comes. Robert had talked of stags and boars and the taste of sweat and blood from the same cup, heaping the words on each other until even he was disgusted with their abundance. Cersei encouraged it with an acid smile. Renly did not return to the city to join it. That was a choice, and a show both. Eddard went because he would not be the one who made a king feel mocked. Lancel Lannister poured wine because he had been given that as his purpose for the week. The world watches at moments like that, the way a crowd watches the pause between the juggler's catch and throw. The Vale camp did not notice for a day, and then did, when a courier stumbled in, with a face like a man who has run thirst past the point of sense, and feels no better for stopping. He had ridden from Bitterbridge to Storm's End in 4 days, which was not sensible and was sufficient, and his horse was grateful to be at the end of both. Robar was the one who caught him as he slid. So he heard the words unmediated by herald or woven into a courtly speech. They were simple and did not need embroidery. He took them to Renly with dust still damp on his sleeves, where he had spilled water over the man's head. Renly listened as a man listens for a tone in a hall he knows well. Something in him went very still. "Send for Jon," he said. "Send for Sir Courtenay. Bind Loras." He stood alone for 1 minute after the page ran. The minute was only a minute, but it left a mark. The sea went on with its long dumb thought. Outside the tent, a pot hissed as steam found its escape and made it. Jon Royce came in like a door opening in midwinter, bringing the smell of iron and clean cold. Loras came in a half-beat later and went to the far side of Renly, where he could see his face and not be seen by him. Courtenay Penrose's boots made little pocks of dirt on the rugs. "The king is down," Renly said. He kept it spare and made it more terrible thereby. Hunting accident. The boar's tusk. The wine. The boar again. The wound was ugly. There was deathbed talk. There was a parchment. There is a queen. Jon's mouth did not move for the space between 2 breaths. Then it became the hard line a smith makes with a last blow of the hammer, the one that defines the blade. "When?" "Yesterday morning," Renly said. "We have this as men have anything." "Late." "Eddard Stark?" Jon asked. Renly's smile was like a knife that had been put away, but kept in hand. Doing his duty. Perhaps using parchment as a sword. Perhaps thinking that a city full of knives can be brought to a halt by ink. "Now." "And you?" Jon said. "Not in the city," Renly said, and it was both his greatest weakness and his advantage in that moment. "I have men. I have ships. I have a road to Highgarden and a hall at my back that will not shut its doors to me when I name myself in it. I do not have the throne room. Not today." "Then you will not try to take it today," Jon said, cementing a restraint that had offered itself freely. "No," Renly said. He laughed once without pleasure, a bark that made Loras' hand tense against his thigh. "I will try to take the world without that room. For a week. Then we will see if the room comes to me of its own will, like a sulky dog at last." "Dangerous," Courtenay said, not unkindly. "Leaving it to sulk longer makes it bite." "I am too pretty to be bitten," Renly said, recovering himself with conscious arrogance, and enjoying his own show just enough to make the others forgive it. "I will write. No, I will ride the Mander when Mace comes up it, and let the river carry our talk faster than a man can argue. Loras, you will go to your father ahead of me. Tell him that the east is a feast untouched. Tell him that the north will be slow. Tell him that the West will be lions in their den, and that a den can be ringed. Nan. Shall I tell him you will make him protector of the South? Loras asked smoothly. Tell him I will make him the happiest man in Westeros if he does not embarrass me, Renly said, and the humor in it made the promise real. To the Vale? Jon asked, because men remember their duties in the hour when other men begin to dream too loud. You have done a brave, foolish thing for me, Renly said, and it was the first time he had named the risk, which made the naming feel like a gift. I would not have it said that I take brave, foolish things and break them against my brother's wall. Go to Gulltown with the third wave. Send to the Eyrie. Tell Lysa that the hour has come when hiding will no longer look like piety, only fear. Tell her I will be gentle to her boy. Tell her I will be grateful to her. Choose the words that fit her ear. You have heard sharper winds than any that blow through her windows. Then so. Jon ran a thumb along the edge of his beard. I will tell her that the sea does not choose the ship. It takes the one brought to it. If she will float, she must come down to water. Say that too, Renly said, pleased. That night the camp did not sing. Men ate and went to their blankets and stared at the cloth above and imagined rooms in the Red Keep where fires smoldered and men set paper down and reached for hilts. A dog worried a bone until it got the last of the fat and then lay on its side sighing. A horse whickered in its sleep. Another answered as if to soothe it, as if horses could spare men's fears by taking them into their broad, patient heads. Far up in the Eyrie, Lysa read a message twice, and then 3 times, and felt her mouth go dry in a way that even Coleman's bitter draught could not cure. She went to the nursery and woke her son by simply standing there. His sleep is always aware of her. She took his hand and promised him in a voice that sounded to her like a harp note that could be held forever, that his world would be made soft for him. He cried because he had been woken, and because fear and anger feel the same inside a small body. When he slept again, she went back to the moon door and did not open it, and told herself that choices made at night are binding on daylight. In the city, Cersei placed her pawns with a speed that made even Varys blink. Janos Slynt learned that his price had been met and exceeded. The gold cloaks were told to dress themselves in certainty. The boy Joffrey stood tall, because height can be borrowed from a dais. Eddard Stark took the parchment that named him regent, and discovered that ink runs when blood is spilled on it. Swords came out. A boar had died. Now men did. The news of all that came to Storm's End in crooked fashion. A gossip's chirp wrapped inside the neat bundle of an official report. A joke delivered by a man who did not think it was funny and made it more so thereby. A run of ravens that put their claws into men's sleep and dragged it out of them. Renly read a first and a second account, and saw that their contradictions aligned in a comfortable shape. Cersei had cut Eddard, and his honesty had bled. The city had chosen comfort. He did not rage. He did not like to. He did a thing that was more dangerous for a man like him. He smiled. The smile he made then was not for a hall. It was for himself. It said, I knew they would. It said, now they will need a different kind of king. In his pavilion, he took a quill and wrote 6 letters without any flourish. One to Mace Tyrell, because Mace liked to be first to hear good news that he had not helped to make. One to Mathis Rowan, because someone must tell a man like Mathis that good order will be preserved and not be lying when he says it. One to Paxter Redwine, because ships are feelings that need stroking. One to Balin Swan at Stonehelm, because Balin had courage and would bring it if asked. One to a quiet cousin of the Carons, who kept accounts along the marches and might be trusted to see to grain. One to Jon Royce to carry to Lysa, firm without flattery, and a second for Jon's eye alone, with the thought in it that men like Jon require in order to walk forward without hating themselves. He sealed them and handed them and watched them go. He did not pace. He slept for 4 hours and woke without surprise. He had made his days into a tool and meant to use it. The Tyrell banners swelled the horizon like a summer cloud when at last Mace came lumbering up the road with a moving orchard around him. The Vale and Stormlands camps accommodated it like a body accommodates another breath while already inhaling. The press was prodigious. There were arguments about hay and about honor that were solved with coin and with stories told loudly enough to be believed. Mace Tyrell dismounted like a man falling elegantly out of his own legend and embraced Renly with theatrical warmth. He kissed Loras with a father's right and a lord's calculation. He looked at Jan Royce as a man looks at an oak he has decided not to cut down. He talked of daughters and of crowns and of timing and of food, mostly food, and of how it would be a joy to feed the realm once the realm had been reminded that it liked being fed. Renly let him pour, and then put a stopper in him with a hand upon a shoulder, and a sentence that started, "We must not lose good hours to talk." Mace blinked and then nodded, confusingly content. Mathis Rowan smiled the way a cat smiles when a much larger hound lies down exactly where the cat meant him to. Randall Tarley listened from a step removed and decided he would stay until he had seen this pretty play prove whether it had a second act. That night they made a hall out of canvas and ropes and a floor out of tramped turf. Marguerite Tyrell came like a second moonrise when the lanterns were lit. She wore green, but not the green her father would have chosen. It had the gray of willow in it, and the white of foam at the edge of lupins, and it made the candlelight do more work than it had expected. Renly went to one knee and made a show of humility that was not entirely show. He took her hand as if it were not a hand, but a promise that had learned to be warm. She bowed her head just enough, which is to say, perfectly. Loras watched and did not bleed. Or he bled in a place where he had taught himself to like the pain. Robar cheered with his throat and with his eyes. Jan stood and took the measure of the world as it rearranged itself around a young man's beauty and a young woman's poise and the old need to believe that two such can make more order than the god of death will unmake. Courtney Penrose thought of locks and keys and was not entirely comforted. In the hush after clapping fades, Renly raised Marguerite's hand and spoke not to her but to the room. "Westeros," he said, as if the tent could be the whole of it for a breath, "has always wanted two things from its kings: to be left alone and to be called to something better at feast days. I will give you both. I will leave you to your hearths, and I will give you great feasts. I will take your sons to war only when war would have come to your doors if I had not gone to meet it. I will count your grain and not forget to count your pride. I will be a king you can look at without becoming smaller." Mem sound. He did not speak of claims. He did not speak of blood. He spoke as if the table already belonged to him. Men can be fooled by that as by any other perfume. The roar that came was not all Reachman and not all Sellswords. A Stormlander who had never clapped for anything without pay found his palms stinging and stared at them, surprised and not displeased. A day later, the first marriage words were said, not in a sept, not yet, but in a half-lit room whose canvas walls made voices sound larger and softer. A septon stood with a look on his face as if he were afraid of liking what was about to happen, and did so anyway. The 7 cord wrapped around 2 wrists. Men drank afterward and felt safer. Jan Royce bent over a map and drew his finger along the Roseruad to King's Landing, and then back along the Mander to Bitterbridge, and thought of what happens to a body when you cut it in 2 places at once. Lyn Corbray sharpened his sword with a stone that had belonged to his father and his father's father, and imagined drawing it in a hall with marble floors, and the way the light would look along its length. Robar rolled in his blanket and slept badly, and woke smiling. Loras lay with his face turned toward a canvas wall and said nothing when someone who was not Renly touched his shoulder to ask if he wanted company. In the Eyrie, Lysa laughed when Coleman told her that the city had crowned a boy, and then she cried and pressed her hands to her cheeks and said that boys did not belong in crowns unless their mothers had asked it of the world. She took out the first letter Petter had written her and smelled it, and could not tell whether it had any scent left of the old ink or merely the ghost of her own fingers. The Vale's 3rd wave came and went. Sisterman ferries went back and forth with the somber greed that is a virtue when men must be carried across water or be lost to it. An old gull pecked a soldier who had thought to steal an egg and ended by dancing on the spot to his comrades' entertainment. A horse learned to trust the sound of oars where before its ears had said, "Danger." A baker's son from Runestone became known for his talent with yeast. A lord's son from Ironwax learned to sleep on his side to keep a sore hip from souring his temper. Life continued its trick of being both granular and grand. When word came through that Eddard Stark had been taken to the dungeons, and that the city slept under the illusion that it had avoided civil war by creating it, Renly did not call a war council. He called a dinner. The men who came wore the faces they would have worn to a war council anyway. Between courses, he said, "We will go to Bitterbridge," and between two other courses he said, "Jon, your men will move along the coast far enough inland that they will not smell the oysters, but close enough that they will remember what a ship looks like if I need one." And between wine and the next wine he said, "Margaery, if you will, send to your mother and have her write to every woman she knows, with a hall to govern and a husband to slow. Tell them that I will not ask for their sons before I have asked for their opinions." He understood that the realm was partly built on men with swords and partly on women with lists. He meant to inherit both. The march to Bitterbridge was the sort of journey the bards tidy up later. The reality was mud and flies, and the smell of turned earth, and the strange intimacy of seeing so many men relieve themselves behind bushes, because there are not enough bushes in the world for an army. The Reach made parts of it soft with its bounty. The marches made other parts scratch. A lord of the marches told Robur a story of a night when the hills sang with Dornish pipes, and no man slept, and of the morning after when no man complained, because you do not complain when you have been allowed to live. Renly rode at the center when it mattered, and at the front when it mattered more, and at the rear only when there was nothing to be gained by being seen. He was learning. He could feel it in the way his body seemed heavier by an ounce each day, and in the way his laugh had begun to acquire an undertone it had not had when he had been merely his brother's pretty shadow. Loras watched it like a harpist listens when a string stretches toward a note and will either settle there or snap. They came to Bitterbridge with its plankways and its slow brown water and its markets that smell like wealth, kept not too clean. The town had decided it would be happy about their arrival. This is one of the Reach's natural talents. Banners blossomed like a horticultural boast. Mace made much of himself. Mathis began to count grain with a look of relief that the numbers would hold. Paxter sent word downriver that if the city closed its harbor, the Mander would open itself in a mood, and moods were costly to the wrong men. In a tent that had been a barn last year, Renly summoned Jon and Loras and Mace, and Randall Tarley, and two other men whose names will be footnotes. He set a small board down and put 3 stones upon it. 1 green, 1 white, 1 the dull red of baked clay. "Here," he said, tapping the green against the Roserad east of Bitterbridge. "Here," tapping the white along the coastal road where the Vale could sweep and not be swallowed. "Here," putting the dull red squarely on King's Landing without ceremony. "If we move there first, we move into teeth. If we move there second, we move into an open mouth that expects a kiss and receives a bite. If we move there not at all, we invite a pack of smaller mouths to eat our toes and fingers at their pace, and men who lose their fingers find they cannot hold swords." "We should strike," Randall Tarley said. He had the confidence of a man who has been right often enough not to remember when he was wrong. An anvil is only useful to a man with a hammer. "I see a hammer here in this tent." "Mensauhar." "You see a hammer because you are one," Mace said, "but without malice. We must have feasts. We must have marriages. We must have streets that will take us in," Mathis Rowan put in. Quiet, and Renly's appreciative look was quick and sincere. "If we put the city to the sword, the sea will be the only road out. If we do nothing, the road in will be closed to us by men who have more cause than courage. If we move along both lines," his finger traced green and white at once, "we give no man an easy choice whether to join us or stand against." "2 knives, Jon said. "If you cut meat with 2 knives, you had better know where their points are when they come to meet." Renly reached and put his palm over the red clay, closing his hand, and when he drew it back, he had left dust on his skin. "We will not be rushed into making a ruin where there should be a home," he said. "We will not let children starve because it makes a good song to feed armies with their bread. We will not give the lions the excuse to wear the stain they already carry, as if it were a badge. We will ring the city like a party, and make it more pleasant to come out than to hide within. Then ring a den of lions with flower garlands, Randall said dry. Watch how they purr. Give them a path, Renly said. Men love paths. And what of the north? Jon asked, because he would, and because it mattered. The north will come as the north does, Renly said, sober now with a heaviness that sat correctly upon him. Measured. Cold. A great wave that takes longer to make and overwhelms when at last it falls. Eddard Stark is in irons. That will change the sound of their march. I will not speak for wolves. I can only leave the gate open for them. Then leave a gate open in a city you do not possess, Jon said. In every heart that does not like the taste of a child king made by his mother, Renly answered, and made a shape with his hands as if he were catching this airy thing. I will send singers north with my words. I will send grain when I have it. I will send nothing that tastes of Tyrell pride or Veilstone. I will send the thought that their honor and my comfort can take supper at the same table. Down. He looked at Jon longer than he looked at the others. Something passed. It would be called trust later. For now it was merely recognition. Two men in a world of boys and old men. Loras came to him that night and lay his hand on Renly's bare shoulder, in a touch that asked a question that was not about war. Renly turned into it and answered the way men do who know there will always be another dawn. Marguerite slept 5 tents away, her maid on a pallet beside her, her dreams full of rivers and wheat. The marriage that had begun with a cord and a kiss would become what it would become in the order of things. In the order of other things, Renly and Loras made a language of hands and warmth that had its own grammar and truth. At dawn, a messenger found Jon Royce, with a face like a man who had bitten into a lemon and found it sweet. From the eyrie, the boy gasped, as if altitude clung to the words. Jon took the scroll and broke the blue seal. He read twice, and then smiled once. A small winter's sun thing that made men nearby stand a little straighter without knowing why. Lady Lysa writes that the veil stands with Lord Renly for the peace of the realm, he said to Robar, whose whole body leaned toward the tail like a sunflower toward light. She writes that the errant falcon will shelter the weak, and that it remembers old oaths and honors new ones. She writes that she looks forward to an end to disorder. No. She writes much, Robar said, not seeing the private line Jon's eye had taken. A cramped sentence near the end about Sweet Robin's cough, and the thin air, and a dream of a green field by the sea where boys do not wheeze. She writes enough, Jon said, aloud and to himself. Renly took that letter and kissed the seal and laughed in a way that did not quite reach his eyes. Then we are a feast properly laid, he said. Now we will see if the West will come with wine. The West would not. Not then. The West was busy finding ways to be injured without admitting to fear. Tywin Lannister had eyes brighter than the gold that lent his house its pretense at color. He looked east and saw a tree amusing itself by pretending to be a king. He looked north and saw a cold room in which Law had been told to wait outside. He looked west and saw only himself, which had always been his favorite view. In King's Landing, Joffrey sat a throne cut like a trap and said things he had been told were kingly. Sansa Stark smiled and lied as a child learns to when pain comes through smiles and lies only in a certain angle of the mouth. Arya Stark learned how to disappear through doors that the city did not know it had. Varys collected sighs, and Pettier collected debts, and Janos, Slint collected geese to fatten and men to knife when they strayed in alleys. The city is a mouth that will eat any food. At Bitterbridge, a wind ran along the river and turned the water brown to green by inches. Renly went to the bank and knelt and put his hand in the river and made a face of boyish delight at the cold. Jon came to stand beside him. The two men looked like bookends on a shelf that did not know whether to sag or to become proud. You have made a beginning, Jon said, giving the words their weight. I have, Renly said. I have learned that beginnings taste like honey and ashes both. If I am lucky, I will learn to prefer the taste. You will not be lucky, Jon said without malice. Men like you do not have luck. They have other men. Renly's laugh was quick and true, a sound that had been built for rooms and that carried even in open air. Then I have you, he said, and it was both jest and vow. Ships moved at the mouth of the Mander and along the Pale Reach coast, like punctuation added to a sentence after it had been spoken. Messages went back to Storm's End and on to Dragonstone, and up to the Eyrie, and across to Old Town. The world became more itself. The banners flared and slackened with the wind. Horses dozed and stamped. Boys fought over a loaf and then shared it when a woman looked at them. Girls learned new songs and liked some of them. A man wrote his name for the first time on a list that would be burned before the next rain. He showed his friend the ink on his thumb like a jewel. And always the sea, which cares for none of it, moved. And always the mountains, which care in another fashion, stood. Between them, on grass and on paving stones, and in the woods where no man saw, human will made its small, loud shapes. A week later, a raven fell out of the sky above the Vale camp near Bitterbridge and landed like a premonition on the ridgepole of Renly's great tent. The bird had flown long and badly. It looked like a torn glove. It carried a thin roll of parchment that was not tied by any hand in Renly's house or the Vales. It had the smell of cold iron still clinging to it, a smell like Dragonstone's, or like the judgment of a man who does not laugh. Renly read it with his mouth composed. He handed it to Jon without comment. Jon read and handed it to Loras, and did not watch Loras's face. It was short. Stannis wrote short. It said, "Brother, you play at mummery with a stolen crown. The law stands where it stood before you learned to mouth it. I will have my right. Lay down this folly, and bring your men to me, or be numbered with those who prefer light words to hard bread. Stannis of House Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone." Renly folded the letter and set it aside as if it were a knife handed to him hilt first. "We will send him bread," he said after a moment. "2 loaves. Baked this morning. I will not send salt. He keeps his own. We will send a note that says, 'Brother, I invite you to supper. Bring your law. I will bring my cooks.'" Jon snorted. Loras's mouth twitched, not in amusement. He had seen the vein in Renly's temple pulse while he read, and knew that the pulse meant what it meant. Anger checked. Pride harnessed. He admired both. He feared both. He loved both, which is the straight road to trouble. That evening, Robar rode the perimeter with 2 men of the marches who had learned to hear feet in brush and named the walker by the way the grass bent. He listened to them talk about the river's song and pretended for a moment that the world had always been this simple. On his way back in, he passed a small tent from which a baby's fretful cry rose. A woman's voice soothed in the particular cadence that is older than all houses. He found himself thinking of the Eyrie, and of a boy who coughed, and of a mountain that kept him alive like a possessive lover. He touched the rune-scratched gorget he wore, his father's gift, and for the first time since they had ridden out of Runestone felt its weight as a blessing more than an inheritance. They bedded down. A wind came soft from the west. A boy in the outer ring of tents dreamed of being knighted, and woke with his own hand against his teeth, to keep himself from crying out. A man in another ring took a woman who was not his wife into a copse, and did not think himself cruel for wanting comfort more than he feared shame. A squire polished a helm he had already polished, and thought of the way Renly had looked when he knelt with Marjorie's hand in his. A priest of the Mother tied a ribbon to a willow branch and prayed that no man would kill a child tomorrow, if it could be helped. And the story that had been slow by choice and careful from necessity extended itself into the night with the patient promise it had offered since the first raven left the Eyrie. That no turn taken can be untaken, and that roads once made are walked even by men who swear they will not. In King's Landing, Sansa knelt at a window slit and watched the dark and made her careful wishes. Arya crawled under a wagon and bit her hand and told herself that the taste of skin was better than the taste of fear. Cersei woke with the certainty that her son would rule 100 years, and then saw the dawn, and did not quite believe what she had said to herself. Eddard Stark lay in a cell and discovered that a man can sleep even on stone if his body has been taught to do so for long enough. In his sleep he walked the snowfields and did not limp. On Dragonstone, Stannis folded his hands and said nothing for so long that Davos felt the length of it, as if it were a rope he was tied to. Crescent sat and coughed, and did not rise, and wished for old days in which counsel meant more than a seal, Davos thought of the choice men like him are always offered. To be a stone in a wall or a stone throne. He thought, not for the first time, that Renly's wall felt like a place where a man could lean without freezing. On the heights above Bitterbridge, in the last clear hour before the moon rose and spoiled the dark, a fox slipped through briars and sniffed a man's boot and decided it was nothing. The fox had his own roots, his own wars, his own wives, his own winter. The world is always larger than any one plan. But that fact did nothing to make the plans smaller to the men who had made them. Renly slept with his mouth a little open, as boys do, and his hand thrown out toward the empty space beside him where Loras had lain an hour and a lifetime ago. Jon slept on his back and woke twice to check the order of things, and twice found it sufficient. Margaery slept and dreamed of a child in a green field, not the Ares but one lower and softer, and woke with wet on her cheek, and did not wipe it away at once, because sometimes sorrow must be admitted to a bed, or it will make a worse guest later. Morning came as it always does in the Reach, with mist that lifted reluctantly, and then all at once, revealing a world that had decided it would be kind for a few hours. Men rose and pissed and laughed and put on their burdens and called them armor. Somewhere, a woman sang while she cooked, a song about a miller and a girl, and a trick with a ribbon that no one ever remembers right. The air smelled of river and oiled leather and hope. Renly came out and looked over his camp and loved it. That was dangerous. He loved the men in it in the way a man can love a map, and not know he has forgotten the mountains. He loved the way the Tyrell green laughed against the Vale blue, and the Stormland saffron, and the small unimportant badges of small unimportant men who mattered more than the badges. He loved the sound a lance makes when a squire knocks it against another because he has not learned to keep quiet. He loved the reach of his own intention. Today we plan an escort for a train, he said to Jon, falling in beside him as if there had never been a time when they had not walked together in mornings. Grain to the small holdfasts, south of the Roserad. A short errand, and yet like the world in miniature. We will see who steals, who protects, who looks away, who sings. Then we will have our tune, Jon said. We will, Renly said. And by the time the city notices, I mean to have taught the realm to hum it. Wonder. The morning broke clean as a blade. Mist took its time lifting from the damp hollows, and then fled as if it had been caught stealing. Men moved through the white breath of the river and the low exhalations of their mounts, putting order to small things so that larger ones would not betray them. Renly went to the quartermaster's rows and looked over the grain wagons, the way a cook eyes loaves. Barrels of oats for horses, sacks of barley and wheat, a cart of hard-baked rounds that could blunt a knife, bundles of onions and ropes of garlic like peasant jewelry. He put his palm to a wheel and felt the coolness of iron banding. He spoke to a wheelwright about wedges, and to a boy about keeping covers tied so rain would have to argue to get at the food. Jon Royce came out of the fog like a fact. He carried no badge of office beyond the way other men's spines remembered to stiffen when he was near. I'll want 24 of your steadiest men, he told Robar without preface, and not the ones who can be tempted into races. Tell them they will walk one on each side of the lead wagons, and they will be bored, and they will like it for my sake. Them see. They'll like anything for your sake, Robar said, grinning, but want to do it without another word. Loras intercepted him, one hand on a horse whose eye watched everything and believed none of it. You have a turn like a songbird today, Loras said. Is tedium such music? Tedium that ends with bread is a better tune than music that ends with blood, Robar said, proud of the sentence as soon as he had said it, and a little ashamed of the pride. Come ride with us, and you can complain to me about how slow the carts are, and I'll pretend not to be impressed that you can complain prettily while keeping a pace. Loras's mouth quirked. I can do 2 things at once, he said, and then lower. I will ride your flank. If this is an errand, let it be one we learn from. Renly sent the train with a little show, because shows oil wheels. He spoke the names of the villages the wagons would visit, Caswell hamlets near the bridge, 2 Marcher farms under Randall Tarley's dour blessing, a scattering of poor holdings whose people came down to the road with hands already out and eyes hungry for reassurance. He gave command of the escort to Jan with a flourish that was not quite a jest. The order of march was made plain. Vanguard of Stormlanders on light horses, wagons in line 4 deep where the road permitted, Vale men walking, side guards to cut off any rush, Tyrell levies at the rear with a small cart of spare wheels, and a larger bucket of water that men were not to drink from unless told. "Keep the pennons furled," Jan said as they stepped off. And to Robur he added, "You open your banners when you want to announce to thieves where the richer pickings are." They went by the Roserad in a world that had decided to be bright. The planks at Bitterbridge drummed under hooves. The river slid like dulled bronze. In the first 2 miles, they passed 3 girls carrying baskets of cherries who could not stop peeking at Loras, until one stumbled, and the fruit rolled and Robur jumped down without thinking to help gather the red dots from ruts and roots. The girls thanked him with the solemnity of women who have learned that humility is a safer charm than beauty. Farther on, a man in a hedge hat raised a hand to beg, and then lowered it again, because the sight of a disciplined column made his plea feel like an interruption of something larger than himself. Jan nodded to him as they passed. The man remembered the nod later with a pride that warmed him twice that week. They made the first delivery to a low-walled hamlet, whose square had once been a pig yard and had not outgrown the habit. The elder had a back that had been bent by harvests, but a voice that stood upright. He took the sacks of barley with a care that looked like worship, and then set 2 aside, and insisted on paying for them with little coin, and 2 smoked eels, and an apology for the eel's size. "The little ones taste of honest ponds," he said. "The big ones taste of the men who stole them from us. Keep your coin for salt," Jan said, counting the sacks without looking at his fingers. "We are not beggars. We are not thieves. Tell your folk that if men in green cloaks or blue cloaks come and demand twice as much tomorrow, you are to show them this mark." He sketched a falcon with a square stroke on the lip of the hamlet's well with a piece of charcoal. "And if they are honest men, they will send for me. If they are not, they will not like what happens. Men who wear cloaks always have cousins," said a woman standing behind the elder, arms folded, hair in a rope. "Those cousins always have knives. What happens is that the cousins do not like to be told they are cousins." "And now, what happens," Jan said without irritation, "is that I find out whether they are cowards. Most men are, given long enough. The brave ones are too busy to rob you." Loras watched him with the interest a fencer gives a good blade. Robur watched the children who had drifted into the square to see what the metal gleam on belts meant. He took a penny from his purse and closed a boy's hand on it, until the boy could feel the shape as well as the value. "If anyone takes it," he said quietly, "tell them Robur Royce will ask them why. Say it like a child who knows his father will come." In the second village, there was quibbling about measures. Men who had stood too long in halls, learning to be exact, do not stop their habit in fields. Jan let the quibble run until the man he was not looking at became embarrassed by hearing himself, and then he cut it with a word that had no sharp edges in it, but did the work. In the third place, a boy tried to steal a slice of cheese, and was caught by a woman who was too thin to be angry. She made him return it with an apology, and Jan made him keep it with a glance that turned the apology to something he could swallow. By noon they had found the rhythm. The Vale men called it a march, the Reach men a ride, the Stormlanders a chore. When a handful of men in mixed leathers stepped out of a spinney near the verge and asked for a toll to be paid in silver per hoof and wheel, Jan did not tell them no. He told them that if they stood to their demand, he would take their names and require them to state their liege, and if they could not, he would tie their thumbs behind them and march them back to Bitterbridge and set them to digging latrines for a fortnight, so that every man who used them might know the names of those who had asked honest men for coin on a road, paid for by the men they would have robbed. The spokesman, a fellow with a beard like burnt straw, began with a swagger and ended with a sneer that looked like a pout. "You've a way with words for a man in mail. I have a way with hammers for a man without shame," Jan said. "Choose which craft you admire." He did not raise his voice. Behind him, he did not need to turn to know that Loras's lance had become suddenly lighter to hold, that Robur's body had learned to wait. They chose to melt back into the trees the way men do when fear is delayed and dignity offered. Robur let out a breath. Loras spun his lance once with unconscious grace, and then made himself shame-faced for having done a flourish when no audience had earned it. "You threaten like a judge," he said to Jan when they rode on, half in admiration, half in wonder. "I have sat for one too many judgments where flourishes got men killed," Jan said. Then, almost gently, "You do not need to show people that you can cut them. They will believe it if you keep your blade covered." On the second day, the road narrowed and went mean for a stretch where the soil had soured and the hedge had grown impertinent. Flies found the column and decided it was a friend. The wagons creaked in a key that could annoy a saint. Robar began to think less about how he looked and more about how his knees felt. The sound of hooves came ahead and then stopped. The vanguard came back with a report that men had felled 2 small poplars across the way and were arguing about whether to try to pry their roots without breaking them, which would make a further mess of things. Jan swung down and waded into the ditch. He put his hand to a root and laughed, a low, pleased sound men did not often hear from him. This was done by someone who feared being told off, he said, and gave the word to bring up axes. Not by men who knew how to give their fear teeth. If they wanted to stop us, they would have chosen the oak on that slope and brought it down with a wedge and a saw. They did not want to stop us so much as to make us cross with them. "Who?" Robar asked, already sliding into the ditch himself. The smell down there was of damp and rot, and the faint sweetness of things that had decided to go back to earth after changing their minds halfway. "Men from Hayford," said a marcher on the flank, spitting. "Or Rosby's men. They like tolls. Their lords have little to do but remember the last time they mattered. They will find a way to make this our fault." "No wonder. They will find me in their way if they do," Jan said. "Lift from the far side. The whole tree will want to roll if you behave as if it were proper." They cleared the road with less difficulty than the fly-ridden air had promised. When they turned a bend an hour later, 4 men in yellow-brown livery with a black chevron stepped back from the hedge, as if their blades had not quite been drawn. Hayford then. The spokesman was the sort of man who had acquired a belly and not shed the knife in his voice. "My lady bids me ask what cause you have to pass, without the courtesy of sending forward word to her bailiff." "The cause of hunger," Jan said. "We will leave you a copy of our courtesy. Your lady may read it at her leisure." He nodded to Robar, who dismounted and handed the man a folded piece of parchment with Falcon stamped hard into blue wax. The man looked at the seal and decided he could pretend not to be impressed. He made a little show of requiring names. Jan gave his own, which burned. He gave Robar's, which did not yet. He gave Laura's with a small smile, because he knew where gossip had greater wings than ravens. "We are not Lannister men," the Hayford said stiffly as they moved past. "We are men of the Crownlands. Serve the crown by feeding its people," Jan said without turning his head. "We can discuss the color of your livery when they are done chewing." They reached the farthest farm on their list, with light gone slant. A woman stood at her lintel with a child on her hip and a knife in her other hand. She put the knife down only when she recognized the shape of a food sack. "We heard a thing with 3 tails," she said, "the way women sometimes do when they wish to tell the truth, but also want the truth to bear their own mark. Some said that the king had died as pigs die. Some said that his son had been born with teeth like a weasel. Some said that the South had invited the East, and the East had come wearing roses. Men say many things," Robar said, shyly aware that he liked the sound of his own voice when it was used to console. "I can tell you 2 that are true. The king is dead, and your child will eat bread tonight because the East did not stay home. Then I will light a candle for the East," she said, an edge softened by gratitude. And then, almost shyly, "and for the king. Not for his death, for his sleep." They camped that night in a ring of birches that had learned to laminate their leaves against wind. Loras and Robar shared watch with marchers who could find rabbits' nests with their feet. Jan slept 4 hours, the way men who have taught their bodies to rest will, and rose to pace the picket line with a charm in his pocket carved by a daughter when she had been a child. He had never believed in carved luck, but he believed in daughters, which his hand could not tell the difference between in the dark. When they brought the train back to Bitterbridge, The camp felt like a city. Mace Tyrell's pavilion bloomed and sagged like a festival tent that refused humility. A slat-sided booth had been thrown together near Renly's pavilions, where a clerk with a squeaky voice took petitions and handed out tokens that would become audiences as time and whim permitted. There were new banners, new cooks, new quarrels with old smells. The women who had followed the army had sorted themselves into honest camps and other sorts. The two kinds of camp borrowed water and stories and scolded each other with a vigor that hid the ways they shared. Renly held court in a way that ought to have been ridiculous, and was not because he did not pretend to be more than he was. He sat in a carved chair that some carpenter had made from a broken wagon tongue and a prayer for his sons, and he wore a green cloak that had seen salt and a circlet that could be worn without making his head ache. He took the petitions in order and spoke to people as if they were people, which is a trick that never fails to please. He heard a dispute about a trampled melon patch as if it were a matter for lords. He heard a complaint about a stabbed pig as if pigs were as close to kings as men say they are. He told a boy to return a borrowed knife, and then gave him a lesser knife of his own to blunt in the learning. He returned a girl to a mother who had thought to sell her for bread and called the mother brave for admitting hunger had made her stupid. Then he had a sack of flour carried to their tent that night with no note and no witness. Marguerite came and sat on a low stool not quite beside him and gave her quiet to the people who came. She asked the names of infants and remembered them, and asked the names of old men and did not pretend to remember them when they returned a second time. Instead, she made a joke of her bad memory and gave them a right to laugh with her that cost nothing and bought everything. Loras stood sometimes at her shoulder, sometimes at Renly's, sometimes at the edge of things with a distance on his face that made men decide not to interrupt him. He had learned that a beautiful man's silence has weight. Jon did not stand in the tent long. He went where carpenters swore, to hear what swearing could teach. He went where the teamsters bickered, to remind them that bickering over small things spares the big ones. He went to the armorer's where a woman with bared arms and a braid like a rope cursed at a thrown rivet, and then laughed at herself for cursing. He found that he liked the camp. It had the weight of purpose and the smell of many houses. A rider came at dusk with his horse's sides lathered and his eyes full of the sight of too many men. He slid from the saddle at Renly's line of guards and would have fallen if a man had not caught him by the breastplate. The guards moved the way the sea does around a rock. The man had a ribbon of red and white twisted through a ring on his thumb. From Tumbleton, he managed, though no one had asked. Lannister outriders, not in force. Quick as hornets. They burned a stack along the east bank. They took 3 men who ran. They left 2 boys with broken mouths for shouting. Randyll Tarly was in the tent before the words had stopped breathing. He did not bow. He was not a bowing man. "Give me leave," he said. "I will make a lesson." "Make an example," Mace corrected, the pedagogue of appearances. "It is always better to teach elegantly." "Make it clean," Renly said to Tarly, which was both concession and constraint. "And bring me one of them with the manners of a courier." "They have none," Tarly said. His mouth twitched as if movement offended it. "But I will bring you a throat that knows how to shape your name." He went with 200 men and returned with rain in his beard, and a prisoner who looked like a rat brought indoors and ashamed to be seen. The man talked with a suddenness that was less courage than habit. Adam Marbrand's name came out and scurried around the tent. The word Hayford came again, and Rosby, and the phrase, "in the Queen's comfort," as if comfort were a right and not a robbery. Tarly stood like a stake and smelled of horse. Jon's eyes had grown more patient with many days. "We will not let the Roserad become a tale that ends in the same place every time," Renly said. When they were alone, and his voice had hardened, "We will not fight a little battle every day and call it policy. We will not teach our men to be good at funerals." "Now, then we must move," Jon said. "The road exists to be used. If you do not take it, your enemies will. A road untaken is a hostage." Renly nodded, the look of a man hearing a thing he had already told himself when he could not sleep. "The Red Wine Fleet will go to Dragonstone and sit on my brother's door," he said. "Paxter has written to say that his wives will forgive him if he comes home late and very fat with praise. He likes the thought. Highgarden will keep the river honest. Tarly will make the marches bite. You will pull a line along the coast road with your falcons. Not too close, not too distant. I will come behind with a sound like a feast. If the city opens its gates, we will be polite. If it hides, we will show it that hunger can be made to feel like shame. Damn. Margaery's fingers were light on the arm of his chair. Let me write to the Lady of Rosby, she said. She has sons. They are not brave. She is not foolish. She will choose until the choosing is taken from her. If I can make her choice feel like a thing she chose, she will love me for it. That will be worth a bridge thrown across a moat. Right, Renly said, and his gratitude made him shine in a way that had nothing to do with candles. In King's Landing, Petyr Baelish leaned on a sill and watched the river take on the color of old bruises. They will try to draw us out to dance, he said idly to no one in particular, because the girls in his rooms like to be spoken to like counselors as well as like courtesans. We will dance in here with the doors closed. The music is better this way. He had sent a small purse south to a Hayford cousin, and another to a Rosby factor, and a third to a man who pretended to be both. He liked to see which purse bred and which were merely eaten. He had paid a boy to count carts. He had paid another to miscount. Varys stood in the presence chamber and smiled at a chair, then at a tapestry, then at the light bending around the dust. He thought of ravens in 3 places at once. He thought of a little girl with a sword and of a bigger girl with a braiding ribbon. He thought of the smell of the Dragonstone halls and of a red woman's voice like a string tuned a bit too high. He thought of the cost of light, which men do not admit as often as they ought. On Dragonstone, where sea salt made the black stones sweat, Melisandre stood in a place that had never asked for sunlight and let the sparks from her brazier rise and die against the dark above. Cresson coughed himself into a chair and watched with the mix of pity and exasperation an old man reserves for an idea that has learned to walk. Stannis did not watch. He read another letter from his brother and moved his jaw, as if the words were meat that had not been cooked as long as it should. Bring the fleet, Stannis said at last, to Davos, who had learned the art of being taken for furniture until called upon. We will ring Storm's End with wood, as it has always been ringed with wind. The Tyrells will not strike me on the water, not while Mace's pride is tied up in wagons, not while Paxter is doing as he is told, and hoping to be kissed for it. We will make Renly choose between his new bride and my old castle. No. Storm's End is a bride as well, Davos said softly, unable to help himself. She is faithful to the family. She does not enjoy a stranger's hand. She will be mine, Stannis said, and the brazier popped as if a lump of damp had given up its ghost. He did not raise his voice toward Melisandre, but it turned toward her all the same. Pray if it pleases you. I will count ships. No. The red wine fleet took on the pale wind along the arbor and made a show of neatness for the sake of the men on the quays who pretended to be officious. Paxter's twin sons argued over whether to take the lee route along the south of Dragonstone, or a boulder cut that would show better to men who looked from the Hightower windows. They were both good seamen in the way boys from the arbor are who learn to stand on decks before they walk in fields. They both believed the world would be as elegant as their father's table if they arranged it with enough forks. Old Town watched them go with the contemplation of a city that has learned to watch many things. The Hightower's light turned an even face seaward. A novice crossing the square with a book twice the size of his head paused to squint at the lines of sails and then stumbled. His master cuffed him lightly and told him that the sea would still be there when he could read it, which would be never, in the novice case, or too late. At Storm's End, Courtney Penrose sharpened quill after quill, and answered letters that had begun to come in a trickle, and now came like rain. He balanced courtesy against suspicion, and found that he could do both at once if he took very small steps. He met with Renly beneath the long stone of the covered walk and said, unruffled, "If my Lord Stannis sits in a boat and looks at me, I will look back. If he points, I will not pretend the finger is not his. If he asks, I will ask him to say please. If he raises a banner, I will count the threads." "You say please as if it were a sword," Renly said. "It is sharper than most men know," Courtney returned. and it goes into a scabbard clean." Renly laughed and clapped his shoulder and made a remark about thinking better of Penrose's quills than his goats. Penrose let himself be pleased in the old way of men who have decided to enjoy their duties or go mad. News of Eddard Stark's confession, fabricated with enough truth in it to poison, reached Bitterbridge like a smudge on a bright cloth. Oberyn, who had been in the bowels of the Red Keep with his own rough paperwork, spat when he heard it and said something to a rat that made the rat look around as if to see who else had been addressed so familiarly. He took his boys and his stick and his temper and made to leave while the city's attention was on the wrong things. He found a dark-eyed child with a boy's clothes and a sword with a name, and told himself that luck was sometimes a man's earned wages for not looking away when people cried. Sansa stood before the queen with her hands folded the way Septa Mordane had taught her, and made her voice smooth as oil on bread. She said the words she had been given, and in her chest a small buzzing thing stung her heart and then went still. Later, alone, she bit a pillow and made no sound. She thought of Renly's laugh, and imagined it carrying through a hall like forgiveness. She thought of a falcon pin she had once held by chance on a stair where a woman in blue had dropped it. She thought of a wolf, and was angry with herself for thinking of a thing that made her feel ragged. Arya learned more names for fear. She learned that a knot, if chewed, breaks the skin around it before it gives, and that the taste of rope is old and sour. She learned how to move when no one wishes to see her, and how to be seen when it will serve her to frighten. She learned to let a man believe he had given her charity when he had merely lost track of what had been his. At Bitterbridge, Renly broke bread with Margaery beneath an awning that had learned to take wind and not invert itself. He ate slowly for a man with his appetite, and glanced now and then at the light on her cheek. "They will kill him," he said, the rare harshness that had begun to thread his voice showing itself, and the words did not need a name to be understood. "They will make a gesture of it," Margaery said. She had learned to think in two scales at once, a child's breath against a mother's throat, and the arc of a realm's hunger. There are gestures that make men hungry, and others that make them swear never again to go without. "We will feed the second until the first chokes." Renly looked at her, and felt a love not unlike gratitude, and not unlike ambition. He reached for her hand and did not take it because he had learned the value of abstaining in public when the abstention could be believed private and not calculated. Jan returned from the second train with dust in the grooves of his gorget, and a satisfaction that was half worry. "We will only be able to feed so many," he said to Renly. Late, when the camp's noise had settled, "The road to the city will drink more than we can pour. You will be blamed for every stomach that rumbles, even as you are praised for every one that is filled. That is when you will learn if you were meant to do this." "Now, I am meant to do this," Renly said without pride and without false modesty. "Good," Jan said, "because if you were not, you would do it anyway." Days turned like tokens on a table. From the south came word of red wine sails closing like a fist around Dragonstone's black knuckles. From the east came word of Dragonstone's fires, answered by lighthouses that were not lighthouses. From the west, words about Tywin's foragers and Suradam's neat fires and haylofts. From the north, nothing that could be relied upon except the fact that when news came, it would be heavy. The Valemen held the coast road as if it had been an old habit. Stormlanders trotted fields with their easy relationship with rain. Reachmen built ovens larger than some men's dreams. Robar's star rose in the modest way a good lad's will. He learned to keep a line without looking like a man counting. He learned to keep boys from proving themselves by dying. He learned to like Loras with an affection that had found a thinner crust and a richer crumb. Loras learned, more dangerously, to let the lad in and to keep him there without breaking him. Men remarked on the two in a way that pleased both, and that made Jon watch with a father's brisk care. Then the thing that had hung over the world like a second moon dropped. The hour at Baelor's Sept when a boy king made the choice his mother wanted him to make and turned a city into a mouth filled with blood for a day. The report fell into Renly's tent like a spadeful of earth on a coffin lid. He did not weep. He did not speak for a long time. He put his head down on his forearm on the table and let the weight of it travel into wood. When he looked up, his eyes were not dry, but they were clear. "We will not answer this with theater," he said. "We will answer it with bread and with safety and with the kind of anger men can use to build houses. Loras turned away for a moment because he had learned that his face showed too much when he forgot it had audience. Marguerite closed her eyes and saw a girl's pale hands and a prince's pale mouth, and told herself that there were candles enough in the south to burn for many dead, and that she would not let men see her cry for the Northmen, because some tears belong in the dark if you want the rest to do their work in daylight. Jon said only, "Send to the Riverlands. Tell them the east marches. Tell them we will not ask them to carry more than they can without help. Tell them a man with a white beard and a bronze disc remembers what men with red hair and loud voices did for him when he had nothing." Them? Renly reached for pen and wax. His hand did not tremble. "We will show them that a king can be a man," he said, almost to himself. "We will show them that a man can be a king who feeds them." The last of the third wave of Vale ships came in that week with chalk dust on their ropes and a dignity born of repetition. Grafton's men, who had learned to be tired efficiently, unloaded them with curses that had lost their bite and become endearments. A sisterman ferryman told a dirty story to a lad from Ironawx, and blushed halfway through it at the memory of his own wife. At the Eyrie, Lysa received then sent the letter that made her pledge plain and formal. She felt a chain around her wrist loosen a link, and did not see another winding tight about her ankle. She sent Petter a private note with words that could have been read as love or gratitude, or a prayer for absolution. He read it, and smiled at the candle, and blew the flame out with a soft breath. As men always will, they looked at maps, and called them the world. And then they looked at one another, and saw the parts of the world that maps will not hold. Ships took their places. Banners found their winds. The road from Bitterbridge to the city gathered dust like a miser gathers coin. Renly chose a day with a sky like polished tin, and said, "We move," and everything that could move did slowly, expensively, beautifully. He went forward with Tyrell Bloom and Stormlander Honesty and Vale Iron at his shoulder. Jon carved a white line along the coast, never near enough to smell brine, always near enough to make men in Duskendale count barrels twice, and put lanterns on the quays earlier than they had meant to. Loras rode, perfect as paint, and forgot he was perfect enough to laugh like a coarse boy when a goose chased him, which made the men adore him more. Robar showed 2 villages how to stack firewood under a slanted roof, and was praised by an old woman who said he had hands like her dead husband's. Marguerite sat with a girl whose baby would not nurse, and told her that sometimes milk is stubborn and must be tricked. Randall Tarley brought in 3 men with lion badges, and made them say the names of the farms they had intended to burn, and those names were then read at the evening muster, and the men listening thought thoughts they would not have thought without the lesson. Closer to the city, the air changed. It took on that smell King's Landing keeps tucked under its stones. Old wine and fish brine, and the iron breath of too many lives exhaled in too small a space. The rosewood widened and then became a throat. Men who had been singing under their breath grew quiet. The horizon broke in chimneys and towers, and the faint, plucked line of masts. Renly reined in where the land offered a last clean view. From there the city did not look like a trap. It looked like a promise that had been kept by too many and broken by too few. The walls hunched. The gate towers were not so high as memory paints them. Memory makes all defense larger. "Do not be magnificent too soon," Jon said, low. "Let them think they can ignore us. Let them try. It is a gift." "Then tell." Renly nodded. He had learned to like such counsel, which made him different from most men who wore cloaks with embroidery. He lifted his hand in a small, gentle arc, and the army breathed out, and began to arrange itself as if it had been made to fold around cities without killing them. In the Red Keep, Cersei stood at a window and watched the green along the road fold and fold again, and she told herself that it was not fear she felt, only the cold that comes when old stories come to stand outside your door. Joffrey played with a crossbow, and it made no sound. Janos Slynt counted men, and liked the number he got, and then counted again, and disliked it, and told himself the first had been true. Varys smiled at a little girl in rags and gave her a coin wrapped in a strip of blue cloth. When she unwrapped it later, she found it was not gold but bright brass, and she laughed, because brass would buy bread, and she did not mind being fooled when the fooling had been kind. Petyr watched from a lower window and tapped a finger on the stone, the way a man taps the table in time with a tune. He could already hear the next song, faint, correct, inevitable, even as this one swelled. On Dragonstone's black terraces, Melisandre lifted her face to a wind that smelled of cinders and talked to it in the language fire knows. Stannis came to her and did not bow, and did not scowl, which in him was a kind of kneeling. "You say there's a darkness," he said. "There's always a darkness," she answered. Her voice made the dark feel nearer. "It waits where men pretend to find only law. It waits where men pretend to find only love. It waits where men do not admit hunger. There is also light. It is not gentle. It burns." "Thou." "I am not gentle," Stannis said. "No," she said, and smiled in a way that made Davos' hand tighten on the carved rail near the brazier, as if the wood itself might save him from believing something before he was ready. "You are not." They looked east, where a thin, rusty line at the horizon could be mistaken for dawn, and was, in fact, sails. Between these places and these people, ravens still crossed the sky, unaware that men imagine birds carry more than paper. The Vale host, which had been a rumor, became a fact you could count. A weight of iron at the city's eastern hip. The Reach, which had been a fair tale, became grain and horse and ovens. The Stormlands, which had always been a weather, became patience with spears in it. The North was a silence that pressed on men's ears and would, in time, force them to speak differently. Renly looked at the gate as a man looks at a new house. His face was open. He did not raise his voice. "Begin with the bread," he said. "Begin with the music. Begin with the water carts. And find me the men who take orders without needing them," shouted. "I will have words with them as if they were my equals. And I will mean it for as long as it pleases us all." Then Jon turned his horse and went to do the thing he has always done best, finding men who will make other men behave. Loras went to smile at fear until it forgot its own name. Robar went to make sure a boy did not steal a loaf and break his foot running. Margaery went to sit in a tent where women would come and tell her of their men, and of their bread, and of their babies, and she would make some of those stories shorter, and some of them longer. Randall Tarley went to the ditch lines and sniffed at the earth, as if it had secrets it did not know he knew. The day leaned. The city considered itself in this new mirror, and did not yet know what face to put on. On the far side of the narrow sea, a trader lifted a bolt of blue silk and decided it would fetch dear coin in a city that had begun to love the color. In the Vale, a boy stood on the bloody gate's lip and felt the wind push him hard enough to frighten him, and exulted anyway. On the Sisters, a ferryman counted money and then counted blessings, because counting both had kept him alive. In the high white keep above them all, Lysa sat with her son and told him a story about a falcon who did not like to fly but learned because his mother had asked him to. And she made the ending kind, because sometimes you must hear kindness to believe you can make it. No drums beat that first hour. No banners flaunted. The sound was of water and wheels, and the low murmur that armies make when they have chosen to act as if they are not armies at all. The wind took a breath. The world leaned closer to listen, and in that held breath between storm and supper. A better king than most imagined himself to be one, and a harder man than most will ever be let himself be useful to another's dream. And an old realm remembered that it had roads for more than war.